Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the unglamorous corridors of history. I hope this recording finds you in a comfortable position, perhaps lying down already, ready to let the details of the past wash over you like waves on a distant shore. If you're enjoying these deep explorations of historical reality, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me continue creating these lengthy, detailed examinations of the subjects that popular culture prefers to romanticize rather than understand. Where are you right now as you listen to this? Perhaps it's late evening and you're settling in for sleep. Perhaps it's a quiet afternoon and you're seeking something to occupy your mind during a long rest. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you've chosen to spend it here, exploring history's darker truths together. Tonight, we turn our attention to a subject absolutely saturated with romantic misconceptions: Viking Age warfare. Specifically, what battles were actually like for the men who fought them. Not the clean, choreographed duels of television and film. Not the glorious single combat between named heroes that saga literature celebrated. But the actual physical, psychological and medical reality of standing in a shield wall, of killing and trying not to be killed, of surviving or not surviving. The chaotic violence that decided territorial disputes and enriched chieftains at the expense of those who did the actual fighting and dying. This is boring history, remember. We're not here for excitement or heroism. We're here for the exhaustive details that other accounts skip over. The mud, the exhaustion, the infections, the random chance that decided who lived and who died regardless of skill or courage. We're here to understand that the glorious Viking warrior was often a terrified teenager forced into service, that battles lasted minutes rather than hours because human bodies simply cannot sustain that level of violence, that most warriors who died never saw the person who killed them, and most who survived carried wounds, physical and psychological, for the rest of their shortened lives. Picture, if you will, a muddy field somewhere in 10th century England. It's autumn, the campaign season when farmers could be spared from harvest work to serve their military obligations. Two armies face each other across a few hundred yards of churned earth. Most of the men in these formations don't want to be here. Many have never fought before. Some are boys of 14 or 15. Others are men in their 40s who thought their fighting days were behind them. They're cold. They're tired from marching. They're terrified of what's coming. In an hour, hundreds of them will be dead or dying. But before we witness that horror, we need to understand the context, the world that created these armies, the culture that celebrated warfare while obscuring its actual nature, and the archaeological evidence that has finally allowed us to see past the propaganda to the brutal truth beneath. So settle in, dear listener. Let your breathing slow and deepen. We have a long journey ahead through the reality of Viking Age combat. Approximately 2.5 hours of detailed examination. By the end, you'll understand why the romanticized versions exist. Because the truth is too uncomfortable, too random, too devastating to celebrate. The reality of these battles wasn't glorious. It was exhausting, terrifying, often pointless, and always more horrible than any survivor wanted to remember or any culture wanted to preserve. Let us begin. To understand Viking Age battles, we must first establish when and where we're speaking of. The Viking Age traditionally spans from approximately 793 CE, the raid on Lindisfarne that announced Scandinavian violence to the Christian world, to 1066 CE, when Harald Hardrada's death at Stamford Bridge marked the end of the Great Scandinavian Expansion. That's nearly 3 centuries of raiding, trading, settling and fighting across a geographic range that stretched from Newfoundland to Constantinople, from the Arctic Circle to North Africa. But our focus tonight is primarily on the core conflict zones: Scandinavia itself, the British Isles, northern France and the Baltic regions. These were the areas where most Viking Age battles occurred, where shield walls met repeatedly over territorial disputes, tribute collection, dynastic struggles, and the simple economic logic that violence could be profitable for those who survived it. The landscape varied enormously, from rocky Norwegian coastlines to English lowland fields, from Danish forests to Irish river valleys. But certain commonalities united these battlefields. They were places where armies could manoeuvre, where logistics could support military operations, and where the consequences of fighting affected civilian populations who had little say in where the conflicts occurred. The climate matters more than we might initially think. The Viking Age coincided with the medieval warm period, when average temperatures were somewhat higher than the centuries before or after. This made northern agriculture more productive, which supported larger populations, which created more young men available for military service. But it also meant that campaign seasons were tied to agricultural cycles. Spring and autumn were prime fighting seasons, because men could be spared from farming, ships could navigate reliably, and weather was manageable. Winter campaigns occurred but were rare and particularly brutal. Summer was often too hot for sustained combat in armour, and too critical for farming to spare labour. The scale of these battles varied dramatically. A major engagement might involve 2,000 to 5,000 warriors per side, small by later medieval standards, but enormous by Viking Age logistics. Most battles were smaller, perhaps a few hundred per side, resolved quickly through the collapse of one formation. The largest recorded conflicts might have involved 10,000 or more total combatants, though saga numbers are notoriously inflated and archaeological evidence suggests more modest figures. But regardless of size, the experience for individual warriors shared commonalities. The press of bodies in formation, the chaos when formations broke, the random violence that cared nothing for individual skill or status. Viking Age Scandinavian culture was fundamentally contradictory in its relationship with warfare. On one hand, the surviving literary sources, the sagas, the poetry, the historical chronicles, celebrated warriors and combat. The ideal man was brave in battle, generous with plunder, loyal to his lord, willing to die rather than flee. Valhalla awaited those who fell in combat, promising eternal feasting and fighting. Warrior prowess was a path to status, wealth, and reputation that would outlast death itself. But this celebration of warfare coexisted with a reality that was far more complex and far less glorious. Most Scandinavians were farmers, not warriors. They fought when obligated to by law or social pressure, not out of any burning desire for combat. The Lidang system and similar military obligations across the Viking world created armies through coercion as much as enthusiasm. A farmer might be required to serve for a certain number of days per year, or to provide a son for military service, or to contribute to equipping a ship's crew. Refusal brought legal penalties severe enough to compel participation even from the deeply unwilling. The economics of Viking Age warfare further complicated the cultural narrative. Raiding and warfare could be profitable. Successful campaigns brought plunder, slaves, tribute and land. This economic incentive drove much of the expansion and conflict we associate with the Viking Age. But the profits accrued primarily to chieftains and successful warriors, while the costs, death, injury, family disruption, agricultural neglect, were borne more broadly across society. A young man killed in a raid enriched his chieftain, but impoverished his family, who lost a labourer and provider. The warrior culture celebrated the individual achievement while obscuring the collective cost. Social status in Viking Age society was fluid but real. Jarls and wealthy landowners had better equipment, more training, greater experience in warfare. They sat in positions of honour at feasts. Their opinions carried weight in assemblies. Their reputations spread through poetry and saga. Common farmers and labourers had less of everything. Cruder equipment, minimal training, no poetic celebration of their deeds. Yet both groups died at similar rates in battle, because the chaos of combat was democratic in its violence. The expensive sword didn't prevent you from drowning in mud. The years of training didn't stop a random arrow. The noble lineage didn't make you less vulnerable to infection from a contaminated weapon. Religious beliefs intersected with warfare in complex ways. The promise of Valhalla for those who died in battle theoretically made death glorious. But this belief coexisted with very human desires to survive, return home, see family again. The archaeological evidence of protective amulets found with warriors, Thor's hammers, Christian crosses after conversion, various talismans, suggest that Vikings hedged their spiritual bets and feared death, regardless of religious promises. The sagas that celebrated death in battle were written by survivors for survivors, not by the dead who might have had different perspectives on whether their deaths were glorious. Medical understanding in the Viking Age was limited by lack of germ theory, absence of anaesthetics beyond alcohol and herbal preparations, and surgical techniques that were crude by modern standards. Healers worked with empirical knowledge. Certain herbs seemed to help certain conditions, certain treatments appeared to work sometimes, but had no framework to understand why. A sword wound that cut the intestines was recognised as usually fatal, but no one understood peritonitis or sepsis. Broken bones could be set if the break was clean, but compound fractures usually meant amputation or death. Infection was common and poorly understood, often attributed to supernatural causes or imbalances in humours rather than bacterial contamination. This medical reality meant that the actual lethality of Viking Age warfare extended far beyond the battlefield itself. A warrior might survive the battle but die from infection days later. He might live but be permanently disabled, creating economic hardship for himself and his family. The casualty figures we associate with battles often don't include these delayed deaths or long-term disabilities, which likely doubled or tripled the actual human cost of each conflict. The central truth we'll explore over the next 2 hours is this. Almost everything popular culture has taught us about Viking Age battles is wrong. Not wrong in minor details, but fundamentally wrong about the nature of the experience, the skills required, the reasons for survival, and the human cost of these conflicts. The romantic image of Viking warfare, brave warriors choosing glorious combat, skilled fighters determining outcomes through superior ability, honourable deaths in face-to-face duels, obscures a reality that was chaotic, random, brief, and devastating to participants regardless of their skill or status. The archaeological evidence has revolutionised our understanding in recent decades. Skeletal analysis, battlefield excavations, forensic examination of trauma patterns. These scientific approaches have revealed truths that saga literature and contemporary chronicles obscured or ignored. We now know that most warriors who died in battles were young, often teenagers. We know that expensive equipment didn't significantly improve survival rates. We know that battles were brief, usually 20 to 30 minutes of intense combat before exhaustion forced pauses. We know that most deaths weren't from dramatic single blows, but from accumulated trauma, blood loss, shock, and subsequent infection. We also know that the warrior culture's celebration of combat served ideological purposes that required ignoring uncomfortable realities. It was useful to believe that skill and courage determined survival, because this justified social hierarchies and encouraged military service. It was necessary to frame death in battle as glorious, because otherwise the human cost of constant warfare might have created resistance to chieftains' ambitions. The saga tradition, the poetry, the cultural narratives, all serve to make warfare acceptable, even desirable, by obscuring its actual nature. But the bones don't lie in service of ideology. The skeletal remains from mass graves tell us about terrified young men killed while fleeing, about warriors hacked apart by multiple attackers, about the democratic horror of battlefield death that claimed chieftains and conscripts with equal efficiency. The archaeological evidence reveals the mud, the chaos, the friendly fire, the execution of wounded enemies, the disease and infection that killed more than combat wounds, the psychological trauma that broke survivors even when their bodies remained intact. Over the next 25 chapters, we'll examine specific aspects of this reality in exhaustive detail. We'll look at the physical environment of battlefields, the weight of equipment, the formation dynamics, the sounds and smells, the medical realities, the role of luck versus skill. We'll examine naval combat's unique horrors, the use of disease as a weapon, the treatment of disabled survivors, the psychological toll on those who lived. We'll conclude by examining what archaeological evidence has taught us, how physical remains have contradicted and corrected the cultural narratives that shaped our understanding for centuries. This won't be an easy journey. The reality of Viking Age warfare is disturbing precisely because it reveals how little has changed about the fundamental nature of organised human violence. The weapons have improved, the medical care has advanced, but the experience of combat, the chaos, the terror, the randomness, the physical and psychological trauma, remains horribly consistent across centuries. Understanding this reality doesn't diminish the Vikings or medieval culture generally. It simply reveals them as human, capable of creating both remarkable achievements and terrible suffering, often simultaneously. So let us proceed with clear eyes to examine what these battles were actually like. Not for entertainment or excitement, but for understanding. Not to celebrate or condemn, but to witness and remember. The warriors who died in these battles deserve to have their actual experiences acknowledged, rather than romanticised into myths that serve everyone, except the dead themselves. Chapter 1. The muddy reality of battlefield terrain. Picture, if you will, a Viking Age battlefield. Not the dramatic rocky shores or pristine meadows of film and television, but the actual locations where these conflicts unfolded. Most Viking battles occurred in lowland fields, coastal flats and river valleys, places where armies could actually manoeuvre and where logistics made sense. These were also places that turned into quagmires of mud during the spring thaw and autumn rains, which happened to be the prime campaigning seasons when farmers could be spared from agricultural work and when ships could navigate safely. The ground beneath a Viking warrior's feet was treacherous in ways we rarely consider. Imagine standing in a field after 3 days of rain, wearing leather boots that have already absorbed water and grown heavy, trying to maintain your footing while men press against you from behind and enemies push from the front. The mud wasn't just inconvenient, it was knee-deep in places, sucking at every step, making the simple act of maintaining balance a constant struggle. Shield walls, which required tight formation and coordinated movement, became unstable on this terrain. Men slipped, fell into each other, created gaps that enemies could exploit. What made this truly brutal was how the mud killed. When a warrior fell, whether from a wound, a slip, or from being pushed, he often couldn't get back up. With 40 to 60 pounds of equipment including shield, mail, helmet, weapons and waterlogged clothing, rising from hands and knees in deep mud was nearly impossible, especially under the press of combat. Archaeological excavations of Viking Age mass graves have revealed a disturbing pattern. Mud and sediment in the airways of skulls, particularly those found face down. These warriors didn't bleed to death from their wounds. They drowned in a few inches of mud and water, unable to lift their heads, unable to get the leverage to rise, while the battle raged on around them. Consider the last moments of a young warrior at a battle in eastern England, autumn of 937. He takes a sword cut to his thigh, painful but not immediately fatal. He goes down on one knee in the churned mud, and that's all it takes. His shield, still strapped to his arm, presses into the muck. He tries to push himself up, but his mail-clad arms sink deeper. His helmet has shifted, partially covering his eyes. Men step on him, over him, around him, as the battle flows like water around a stone. He manages to lift his face once, gasps for air, gets mud instead. The weight on his back, some of it human bodies, some of it equipment, keeps pressing. his final breath is brown water and earth. So the next time you see a heroic battle scene with warriors maintaining perfect footing on conveniently dry ground, remember that reality was far less accommodating. More Vikings may have drowned in battlefield mud than died from famous named swords. The earth itself was an enemy, and it killed with suffocating efficiency, pulling warriors down into an embrace from which there was no escape. Chapter 2. The actual weight of combat equipment. Let us now turn to the burden that Viking warriors carried into battle. A well-equipped warrior bore substantial weight, distributed across his body in ways that created constant physical strain. The shield alone, circular, made of linden or pine wood with an iron boss, weighed between 15 and 20 pounds. The shield was held constantly in one hand, arm extended throughout the battle. Try holding a 20-pound weight at arm's length for just 5 minutes, and you'll begin to understand the exhaustion. Mail shirts, for those who could afford them, added another 30 to 40 pounds. These weren't the theatrical costumes of film productions, but actual iron rings, individually linked, creating a heavy mesh that pulled on the shoulders and made every movement effortful. The helmet added another 3 to 5 pounds to the head and neck. A sword or axe, another 3 to 5 pounds. A seax knife, everyday items in pockets or pouches, woolen clothing that absorbed water and doubled in weight when wet. A fully equipped warrior carried 50 to 60 pounds of gear into combat, and he'd often marched several miles to reach the battlefield while carrying all of it. The physical toll of this burden was immense. Modern soldiers train extensively for months to handle similar loads. Viking warriors, many of them farmers conscripted for seasonal campaigns, had perhaps weeks of preparation at most. The weight didn't just tire them, it slowed reflexes, reduced mobility, made even basic movements exhausting. After an hour of march followed by the initial clash of battle, men were already operating at reduced capacity, muscles burning with fatigue, breathing laboured from the exertion. Perhaps most disturbing of all, many warriors collapsed before they ever struck or received a blow. Archaeological evidence from battle sites has revealed remains showing signs of cardiac arrest or heat stroke, men whose hearts simply gave out under the physical strain. Imagine a hot summer day in eastern Scandinavia, the sun beating down on your mail, your body overheating as you cannot shed the weight you need for protection. Some warriors in Danish burial contexts show evidence of heart conditions that likely proved fatal under battle stress. They came to the field prepared to fight and die heroically, but instead collapsed, clutching their chests, dying unheroically in front of their companions. There's a young warrior in the historical record, his first real battle, somewhere in Norway in the late 10th century. He'd carried his father's mail shirt 5 miles to the battlefield, pride overcoming the growing ache in his shoulders. When the armies finally met, he'd been standing in formation for an hour, shifting his weight from foot to foot, already exhausted. The shield wall hadn't even formed yet when he felt his vision narrow, his legs weaken. He went down on one knee, trying to catch his breath, and an enemy spear found him there, kneeling in exhaustion rather than piety. It's worth remembering that video game characters run endlessly in full armour, never tire, fight for hours without rest. Real humans, even trained warriors, are not so fortunate. The weight of war was literal, measurable in pounds of iron, and it killed through simple exhaustion as often as through violence. Chapter 3. The shield wall formation. Crushing reality. The shield wall was the fundamental tactical formation of Viking Age warfare, and we must understand its brutal mechanics. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, creating a continuous wall of wood and iron. The formation wasn't a single line, but often 8 to 10 men deep. The front rank held the shields, while those behind pressed forward, adding weight and pressure, pushing their comrades into contact with the enemy. This wasn't a position of choice or honour for those in front. It was often a position of terror, The physics of the shield wall created a crushing environment. Imagine standing in the front rank, your shield pressed against the enemy's shield, your body pressed against the man behind you, who is pressed against the man behind him, and so on for 8 or 9 men deep. Each man's weight, plus their 50 pounds of equipment, multiplied through the formation. The pressure wasn't optional. You couldn't step back to catch your breath or adjust your grip. The mass of men behind made retreat impossible. You were pinned between enemy steel in front and friendly bodies behind, with only your shield and the men beside you preventing complete collapse. What made this truly horrifying was that your own side could kill you through simple physics. Archaeological evidence has revealed skeletal remains from Viking Age battle contexts, showing fractured ribs and collapsed sternums from compression injuries, damage that couldn't have come from weapons. These men were crushed to death by the weight of their own shield wall pressing forward. Their ribs broke under pressure, puncturing lungs, making breathing impossible. They died standing up, unable to fall, held upright by the press of bodies around them even as they suffocated. There's a warrior from a battle in Ireland, mid-10th century, whose remains tell this story clearly. His ribs show multiple fractures consistent with sustained frontal pressure. His sternum was completely caved in, but there are no weapon marks on these bones, no cuts from swords, no impacts from axes. The shield wall killed him. Friendly force compressed his chest until his heart and lungs could no longer function. He may have tried to cry out to signal his distress, but in the noise and chaos no one heard. He died with his brothers in arms literally crushing the life from him. This reminds us that modern crowd crush incidents at concerts and sporting events, tragedies where people are pressed to death by the sheer weight of crowds, have ancient precedents. The shield wall was an organised, weaponised version of this same horror. Warriors feared it not just for the enemy swords that might come over the top, but for the possibility that their own side's enthusiasm would kill them through pure pressure. The shield wall was effective, yes, but it was also a meat grinder that showed no distinction between friend and foe when the physics of mass and pressure took over. Chapter 4. The First Minutes. Projectile Hell. Before the shield walls ever met, before swords crossed or axes swung, Viking battles began with a terrifying preliminary phase, the projectile exchange. Both sides, still separated by 50 or 100 yards of open ground, unleashed volleys of arrows, throwing spears and sometimes stones. The sky darkened with these projectiles, creating a rain of death that fell indiscriminately across the formations. Warriors raised their shields overhead, creating a protective roof, and prayed that their shield would stop what was coming. The sound alone was overwhelming. Thousands of projectiles whistling through air, the thunk of arrows embedding in wood, the crack when a spear shaft struck a helmet, the wet sound when one found flesh instead of armour. Men screamed when they were hit, dropped their shields, creating gaps in the overhead protection that let more projectiles through. This phase lasted only minutes but felt eternal to those enduring it. There was no skill involved in survival, no heroic technique. You either stood in the wrong place or you didn't. An arrow meant for the man beside you might catch you instead. A spear thrown wildly might find your unprotected leg. The darkest aspect, however, was the archaeological evidence for friendly fire. Analysis of Viking Age battle remains has revealed arrow wounds with trajectories that make no sense if all projectiles came from the enemy. Arrows embedded in backs of skulls at angles suggesting they came from behind or from the side, from the direction of friendly forces. In the chaos of volley fire, with hundreds of men launching projectiles simultaneously, many struck their own comrades. Some skulls show evidence of blunt force trauma from stones, which were often used to supplement limited arrow supplies. These stones had no accuracy. Whoever they hit was purely random. Consider a veteran warrior, 30 years old, who had survived a dozen battles through a combination of skill and luck. He stands in formation at a river crossing in Northumbria, shield raised overhead with his companions, waiting for the order to advance. The arrow that kills him comes from behind and slightly to the left, his own side most likely. It punches through the back of his helmet where the iron is thinnest, penetrates his skull, and kills him before he even knows he's been hit. He dies in the first minute of a battle he's not even part of yet, killed by an ally whose name he'll never know. We can scarcely imagine the psychological horror of this phase. At least in close combat you could see your enemy, react, fight back. In the projectile phase you were utterly helpless, waiting for random death to fall from above. The warrior ethos spoke of courage and skill in battle, but this opening phase rendered both meaningless. You stood, you waited, and you hoped. Nothing more than that. Most men who died in Viking battles never got close enough to use their expensive swords or swing their carefully maintained axes. They died in the first minutes, killed by projectiles they never saw coming, possibly launched by the very men they'd shared breakfast with that morning. Chapter 5. What swords actually did to human bodies. Let us examine the forensic reality of sword wounds, because the truth is far more disturbing than any dramatic depiction. Viking Age swords were well-crafted tools of pattern-welded steel, sharp enough to cut leather and flesh, heavy enough to break bones through impact, but they rarely killed cleanly or quickly, and the archaeological evidence from mass graves shows us exactly what swords did to human bodies in the chaos of battle. Most sword wounds weren't the dramatic chest or neck strikes of fiction. They were cuts to limbs, forearms, hands, legs, inflicted as combatants tried to disable each other. These wounds bled profusely, caused shock and pain, but didn't immediately kill. A warrior with a severed tendon in his sword arm could no longer fight, but might live for hours, lying on the battlefield among the combat still raging around him. Skeletal evidence shows us these patterns clearly. Defensive wounds on forearms where warriors raised their arms to protect their heads, severed fingers where sword strikes caught hands gripping weapons, deep cuts to shins and thighs where low strikes targeted mobility. The most common pattern found in excavated remains is particularly disturbing. Defensive wounds to hands and forearms, followed by fatal wounds to the head and neck. What this tells us is that a warrior would raise his arms to protect his face from an incoming strike, an instinctive human reaction. The sword would cut through his hand or forearm, injuring but not killing him. But raising his arms meant exposing his neck and face, which were previously protected by his shield position. The follow-up strike would then come down on his now unprotected head. Skulls from Viking Age battle contexts show this clearly. Deep cuts that split through bone, exposed brain tissue to air, destroyed jaws and facial structures. Perhaps most disturbing of all, these wounds didn't kill instantly. Medieval medical texts and saga accounts mention warriors living for hours or even days with terrible facial and head wounds. One skull from a mass grave in Dorset shows a sword cut that removed the entire lower jaw and chin. The warrior lived long enough after this wound for the edges of the bone to show evidence of inflammatory response, meaning he survived for at least several hours, unable to speak, unable to drink, bleeding slowly from the massive facial wound, fully conscious of his approaching death. There's a warrior from a 10th century battlefield in Scandinavia whose skull tells a particularly brutal story. He has defensive wounds on both forearms. The bones show deep cuts where he raised his arms against attacks. Then there's the kill strike, a massive blow that split his skull from crown to eye socket, dividing his head nearly in half. But that wasn't the only wound. There are two other skull cuts, slightly different angles, suggesting multiple attackers. He didn't die from a single heroic duel, but was hacked apart by several men simultaneously in the chaos of melee. So the next time you see a movie death where someone takes a sword strike and falls gracefully, remember the medical reality was far messier, far slower, and far more painful. Warriors didn't die poetically in battle. They died screaming, bleeding, sometimes taking hours to finally succumb to wounds that had already doomed them. The sword was efficient at creating injuries, but those injuries killed through shock, blood loss, and the collapse of biological systems over time, not through some clean instant transition from life to death. Chapter 6. The Sound of Battle. The auditory environment of Viking combat was overwhelming in ways that visual depictions can never capture. Imagine standing in a shield wall as it meets the enemy, thousands of men simultaneously screaming war cries to bolster their courage and intimidate opponents. The sound of these voices alone was deafening, a roar that made verbal communication impossible beyond a few feet. Commanders couldn't issue orders once battle was joined. Warriors couldn't coordinate with anyone beyond the immediate men beside them. The wall of sound created isolation, even in the midst of hundreds of companions. Then came the percussion of battle itself. Shields colliding with shields created a massive crack like thunder, repeated continuously as formations pressed against each other. Weapons striking wood produced a steady rhythm of impacts, axes embedding in shield rims, swords biting into linden planks, spears punching through. When weapons found metal, the sound changed to a ringing clash that could be heard across the battlefield. When they found flesh and bone, the sounds became wet and crunching, sounds that warriors would hear in their nightmares for the rest of their lives, however long that might be. The human sounds were perhaps the worst. Wounded men screamed in agony, creating a chorus of suffering that underscored the entire battle. Death rattles, that distinctive wet gurgling sound of someone drowning in their own blood, merged with shouts and cries. Bones breaking produced sharp cracks distinct from wood or metal. Skull splitting made a particular sound that eyewitness accounts mention with horror. And throughout it all, the constant heavy breathing of exhausted men gasping for air, hyperventilating from fear and exertion. What made this truly brutal was the permanent damage this noise inflicted. Archaeological analysis of Viking Age skeletal remains, particularly those from known warrior contexts, shows an unusually high incidence of hearing damage. Perforated eardrums, bone changes in the inner ear structure, patterns consistent with severe acoustic trauma. Some of this was from direct weapon impacts near the head, but the sheer volume of sustained battlefield noise also caused permanent hearing loss. Warriors who survived battles often lived the rest of their lives in a muffled, diminished auditory world, unable to hear their children's voices clearly, unable to participate fully in the social life that depended on oral communication. Consider a warrior in his third major battle fighting somewhere in the Danelaw. The noise is overwhelming, disorienting. He can't hear his commander's shouts anymore. His ears are ringing from a sword strike to his helmet in an earlier skirmish. That ringing never fully stopped. It's always there now, a high-pitched whine that makes everything else seem distant and unclear. When his commander signals a tactical withdrawal, he doesn't hear it. He doesn't see the hand signals through the press of bodies. He keeps fighting while his unit retreats, suddenly alone and surrounded because his damaged hearing isolated him from the crucial communication. His body is found days later, cut down while fighting alone against a dozen enemies. It's hard not to think of modern veterans discussing how certain sounds trigger memories. Car backfires that sound like gunfire, doors slamming that recall explosions. Viking Age veterans had no framework for discussing these triggers, but saga accounts occasionally mention warriors who became violent or distressed at feasts when benches scraped or metal cups clattered. The sound of battle never truly left them. They carried it in their damaged ears, in their startled reactions, in the nightmares that made them wake screaming decades after their last fight. The auditory assault of battle was as damaging as the physical wounds, and lasted just as long. Chapter 7. The Smell. Visceral reality picture, if you will. The olfactory assault of a Viking battlefield. Smell is the sense most powerfully linked to memory in the human brain, yet it's entirely absent from our visual depictions of medieval warfare. The reality was that battles stank with a distinctive, overwhelming combination of scents that marked them as places of death and suffering. Understanding this dimension helps us grasp how thoroughly horrible these experiences truly were. The smell of fear came first. Before the fighting even began, men packed shoulder to shoulder in shield walls, many of them terrified, released stress hormones through their sweat. Adrenaline has a distinct acrid smell. But fear also loosened bowels. Medieval sources freely acknowledge that many warriors defecated themselves before or during battle, an involuntary physiological response to extreme stress. Multiply this by hundreds or thousands of men in close formation, unable to move or clean themselves, and the stench became overpowering. Then came the smell of blood, which has a distinctive metallic scent from the ion in hemoglobin. When hundreds of men are bleeding simultaneously, when blood is pooling on the ground and splashing on weapons and armour and faces, that smell becomes thick in the air. Mixed with it was the smell of vomit, from seasick raiders who'd just come ashore, from men whose terror or exertion triggered nausea, from warriors who'd taken gut wounds and were emptying their stomach contents. The combination created an olfactory environment that itself triggered more vomiting, a cascading effect that added to the sensory nightmare. But the worst smell, the one that medieval sources specifically mention with horror, came from perforated intestines. When a sword or spear penetrated the abdomen and cut through the intestinal wall, it released digestive contents into the body cavity. This produced a smell so distinctive and foul that experienced warriors knew it immediately. The smell that signalled a mortal wound and a slow, agonizing death from peritonitis. The smell of death, quite literally, surrounding someone who was still technically alive but whose fate was sealed. Archaeological evidence supports this horror. Mass graves from Viking Age battles show bodies that were handled with clear disgust. Many have their faces covered with fabric or shields, positioned face down, buried quickly. The smell of death made handling corpses unpleasant work that was completed as hastily as possible. Bodies left on battlefields for days before burial became even worse as decomposition accelerated, bloating and releasing gases, attracting scavengers whose feeding added its own dimension to the stench. There's a young warrior, perhaps 16 years old, at his first battle somewhere in what's now England. The shield wall forms, and immediately he smells things he's never encountered before. The collective fear sweat of the formation, the vomit of the man beside him who couldn't control his nerves. When the walls meet and the first wounds are struck, the smell of blood fills his nostrils, unlike anything from farm butchering. This is human blood, more pungent, mixing with mud and sweat. Then someone near him takes a belly wound, and that smell hits. The unmistakable stench of perforated intestines. He vomits reflexively, violently, while still trying to maintain his shield position. The vomit goes down the front of his tunic. He fights for another hour wearing it, smelling it, unable to clean himself. He survives this battle, but that smell, that combination of scents, will mark certain moments in his life forever. A butchered pig decades later will trigger a flashback so intense he has to leave the feast. We can scarcely imagine this dimension of battle because we've never experienced it, and our media cannot convey it. But for the men who stood in shield walls, smell was as much a part of the horror as sight and sound. It marked battle as a place of bodily functions gone wrong, of human fragility exposed, of death made tangible in the air itself. Warriors couldn't escape it by closing their eyes or covering their ears. Every breath brought it in, and it stained their memories in ways that other senses could not. Chapter 8. Berserkers, Myth versus Drugged Reality. Let us now turn to one of the most romanticised aspects of Viking warfare, the berserker. Popular culture presents these warriors as fearless, shirtless champions who entered battle trances and fought with supernatural strength. the historical reality was far more disturbing and far less heroic. Berserkers were likely individuals who combined psychological instability with deliberate intoxication, and they were as dangerous to their own forces as to their enemies. The evidence suggests berserkers used intoxicants to achieve their battle state. Henbane, a plant with powerful psychoactive properties, grew wild across Scandinavia and produces effects including pain insensitivity, aggression, hallucinations, and loss of impulse control. Alcohol, consumed in large quantities before battle, had similar though less extreme effects. Some sources mention mushrooms, possibly Amanita muscaria, which causes dissociation and aggressive behaviour. These weren't mystical trances, but drug-induced states that removed normal human restraints against violence and self-preservation. But drugs alone don't create a berserker. These men were likely selected from those already prone to violence and psychological instability. Some archaeological remains from warrior contexts show evidence of healed head trauma, old injuries that might have caused personality changes and impulse control problems. Others show skeletal markers consistent with certain neurological conditions. The saga descriptions of berserkers frothing at the mouth and being unable to distinguish friend from foe sound very much like individuals in psychotic or dissociative states, possibly with underlying conditions exacerbated by intoxicants. What made this truly dark was how berserkers were treated within Viking armies. They were kept separate from regular warriors because they couldn't be controlled once their frenzy began. Saga accounts mention berserkers killing their own people during battles, attacking indiscriminately, unable to stop once violence began. After battles, they were often abandoned or even killed by their own side if they remained dangerous. They weren't honoured heroes but expendable tools, sent in first to break enemy lines, expected to die, and killed if they survived but remained uncontrollable. Archaeological evidence hints at this grim reality. Some warrior burials that may be berserkers show patterns consistent with execution rather than battlefield death. Strikes to the back of the head, restraint marks on wrist bones, isolated graves away from other warriors. These men weren't given honoured burials with their shield brothers. They were disposed of, their social utility exhausted along with their lives. Consider a young man in Norway, the late 10th century, who shows signs of what we might now call antisocial personality disorder. He's violent, impulsive, struggles to integrate into his community. A local chieftain preparing for a raid recognises these traits as potentially useful. He gives this young man henbane before battles, encourages his violent tendencies, uses him as a berserker, a shock troop who will charge enemy lines without thought of death. The young man serves through several campaigns, and his violence is useful. But after one battle, still in his drug-fueled frenzy, he attacks a fellow warrior. The chieftain makes a decision. This tool has become more liability than asset. The young man is struck from behind, efficiently killed, and buried in an unmarked grave away from the other fallen warriors. No saga mentions his name. No poet praises his courage. He was used and disposed of. So the next time you encounter the romanticised berserker in popular media, the fearless champion choosing to fight shirtless, the honourable wild warrior, remember the reality was likely troubled individuals, intoxicated and exploited, dying or being killed when their utility ended. Viking society didn't celebrate berserkers as heroes. It weaponized the mentally unstable and addicted, then discarded them when convenient. The berserker tradition wasn't about honour or courage, but about the ruthless willingness to exploit any advantage, even if that advantage was a damaged human being pushed past all limits of self-preservation and sanity. Chapter 9. The Age of Combatants. Children in Battle. We must confront an uncomfortable truth about Viking Age warfare. Many combatants were what we would consider children. Archaeological analysis of skeletal remains from battle contexts reveals warriors as young as 14 to 16 years old, determined by bone development and dental patterns. These weren't rare cases or accidents, but a systematic inclusion of adolescents in warfare, driven by both cultural expectations and economic pressures. Viking Age societies had different concepts of adulthood than modern Western cultures. Boys were expected to participate in adult activities much earlier. A 14-year-old was considered capable of labour, of bearing arms, of contributing to the family's military obligations. When chieftains called up warriors for raids or battles, they counted households and expected able-bodied males above a certain age, usually around 13 to 15, to appear. Poor families couldn't afford to send their primary breadwinners, so they sent sons instead. These adolescents went to war carrying their father's or older brother's hand-me-down equipment, often poorly fitting, facing experienced warriors in their first combat. The inexperience made them particularly vulnerable. Shield walls required coordination, discipline, the ability to maintain formation under stress. Young warriors lacked the physical strength and psychological conditioning to hold their positions when the formations met. They panicked more easily, broke ranks more readily, made fatal mistakes that veterans avoided through hard-won experience. Archaeological evidence shows this clearly in the wound patterns. Analysis of mass graves from Viking Age battles reveals a disturbing pattern. Adolescent skeletons show disproportionately high numbers of defensive wounds and injuries to the back. Defensive wounds, to forearms raised protectively, to the back of the head as they ducked, suggest they were overwhelmed by attacks they couldn't counter. Wounds to the back indicate they turned to flee, breaking from formation, and were cut down from behind. Some remains suggest even darker fates. Wounds consistent with being killed by their own side to prevent routes that might collapse entire formations. A fleeing adolescent warrior endangered everyone around him, and in some cases commanders or veteran warriors stopped the fleeing rather than let panic spread. Picture a 15-year-old boy standing in a shield wall, somewhere in eastern England, mid-10th century. This is his first real battle. His father sent him because the family owed military service, but couldn't spare the father who was needed for harvest. The boy carries his grandfather's old sword, slightly rusty, the grip worn smooth by hands long dead. His shield is new but poorly made. His family couldn't afford better. When the enemy shield wall approaches, the boy can feel his legs shaking. The warriors press forward. The crash comes. The boy's shield splinters on first impact. That cheap wood couldn't hold. He has no training in fighting without a shield. Panic floods him. He turns to run. The man behind him, a veteran who knows that fleeing spreads like disease, makes a split-second decision. His axe comes down on the back of the boy's head. Better one dead boy than a collapsed formation. The boy's body is found after the battle among the enemy dead, and everyone assumes he died fighting bravely. His family never knows the truth. It's worth remembering that we react with horror to child soldiers in modern conflicts, considering their use a war crime and a sign of societal breakdown. Yet we romanticize Viking warriors without acknowledging that many were teenagers, coerced into combat by economic pressures and cultural expectations, dying in terror in their first battles. The glorious warrior culture looks far less glorious when we see the adolescent remains in mass graves, killed before they were old enough to fully understand what they were dying for, their potential lives, cut short to settle disputes between chieftains they'd never met. Chapter 10. Blood Loss and Shock. The Real Killers. Let us examine what actually killed Viking Age warriors, because the answer is often not the dramatic weapon strikes of popular imagination. Most battlefield deaths resulted from blood loss, shock, and the cascading failure of biological systems following injuries. A slow process that could take minutes to hours. Understanding this medical reality reveals just how horrible survival rates truly were, and how much suffering occurred between wounding and death. Blood loss operates on a predictable timeline. The human body contains approximately 5 litres of blood. Losing just 1 litre causes dizziness, confusion and weakened pulse. Losing 2 litres brings severe shock, rapid heartbeat, cold, clammy skin, loss of consciousness. Losing 3 or more litres is typically fatal without immediate medical intervention. A severed artery could cause this blood loss in minutes. But most Viking Age wounds didn't sever major arteries. They caused slower bleeding from multiple smaller vessels, meaning warriors took longer to die and remained conscious for much of the process. Shock is the body's response to severe injury. Blood pressure drops. Organs begin to fail as they're deprived of oxygen. Body temperature falls. The warrior might feel cold even on a warm day, might have difficulty thinking clearly, might find his limbs not responding properly to commands. This physiological shutdown occurred even from wounds that weren't directly fatal. A deep cut to the thigh that missed major vessels might not kill through blood loss alone, but could trigger shock that proved lethal. What made this truly brutal was adrenaline's masking effect. During combat, the body's fight-or-flight response floods the system with hormones that suppress pain and maintain function. Warriors commonly fought on with injuries they didn't fully feel. Medieval accounts mention men who continued fighting with terrible wounds, lost fingers, deep cuts, even some arrow wounds, only to collapse when the fighting ended and adrenaline wore off. They walked off battlefields under their own power, sat down to rest, and died from wounds they'd barely noticed during combat. Archaeological evidence supports this grim reality. Many skeletal remains from Viking Age battle contexts show healed wounds from previous conflicts alongside the fresh wounds that killed them. These warriors survived multiple battles, learned from experience, became veterans, yet they still died from shock and blood loss, following wounds that might seem survivable. Their bodies show this clearly. Multiple cuts to limbs that would have been bleeding throughout combat, eventually overwhelming the body's capacity to compensate. Consider a warrior in his 30s, a veteran of 7 or 8 campaigns, fighting at a river crossing in Francia. He takes a sword cut to his left forearm early in the battle. Painful, bleeding, but he shifts his shield grip and continues fighting. Later, an axe catches his right thigh, opening a deep gash. He's still fighting, still functional, adrenaline keeping him upright. The battle ends. His side wins. He walks to the wagons with his companions, joking about the close calls, adrenaline still masking the severity. He sits down to wait for treatment. That's when the shaking starts. His body temperature dropping, his pulse racing, his thinking becoming confused. The camp healer tries to stop the bleeding, but the warrior has already lost too much blood. He dies within an hour of sitting down, surrounded by friends who'd thought his wounds were manageable. His body shows no single fatal injury, just the accumulated damage that proved too much once the adrenaline stopped compensating. So the next time you see a movie character shrug off sword wounds and keep fighting indefinitely, remember that reality was far less forgiving. Modern emergency medicine could have saved most Viking Age battle casualties through blood transfusions, shock treatment, and proper wound care. Without these interventions, warriors died slowly from injuries that didn't look immediately fatal, their bodies shutting down one system at a time while they remained conscious enough to understand what was happening. The battlefield claimed its victims not just during the fighting, but in the long cold hours afterward, when adrenaline faded and the body's limits became tragically clear. Chapter 11. Winter Battles. Hypothermic Horror. Imagine warfare conducted in the depths of a Scandinavian winter, where temperatures plunge well below freezing and daylight lasts only a few hours. Winter campaigns were less common than spring and autumn fighting, but they occurred nonetheless. Territorial disputes didn't pause for weather, and sometimes strategic necessity demanded movement during the coldest months. The warriors who fought in these conditions faced an enemy beyond human opposition, the cold itself, which killed with methodical efficiency. The cold affected everything about combat. Metal weapons and armour became painfully cold to touch. Mail shirts felt like they were lined with ice. Helmets seemed to freeze to skin. Sword hilts had to be gripped through layers of cloth to avoid frostbite on hands. Fingers grew numb within minutes, making the fine motor control required for weapon handling increasingly difficult. Shield grips became treacherous as frozen hands lost their strength. Warriors fumbled with straps and buckles, struggled to maintain proper grip, dropped weapons they couldn't feel properly. The physical toll went beyond discomfort. Shivering is the body's attempt to generate heat through muscle movement, but it burns enormous amounts of energy. Warriors already exhausted from marching in deep snow, already struggling with heavy equipment, found themselves depleted before fighting even began. Frostbite claimed toes, fingers, noses, and ears, tissue literally freezing and dying. Some warriors fought with blackened fingers that would require amputation if they survived. Others developed hypothermia during the battle itself, their core temperature dropping, their thinking becoming confused, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated. What made winter combat truly brutal was how it interacted with wounds. A cut that might bleed profusely in summer barely bled in extreme cold. Blood vessels constricted, blood thickened, clotting happened faster. This sounds beneficial until you realise it meant warriors survived initial wounds that would normally bleed them unconscious, allowing them to continue fighting and accumulate more injuries. But the cold also meant that once a warrior fell, he had almost no chance of survival. Lying in snow, unable to move, body temperature plummeted rapidly. Archaeological evidence from one winter battle site in Scandinavia, dated to the late 10th century through associated artifacts, revealed a horror that skeletal analysis confirmed. The remains showed warriors who had frozen in their death positions. Bodies found face down in snow hadn't just died and then frozen. They'd frozen while dying. Some showed signs of having clawed at the frozen ground, trying to move, trapped by failing muscles and dropping core temperature. Some had died from their wounds, yes, but many had frozen to death while their wounds were still bleeding, the cold killing them before blood loss could. There's a warrior at a winter battle in northern Norway, fighting over a disputed territory in January. He takes a spear thrust to his side. Painful, but the cold means it barely bleeds. He keeps fighting, accumulates 2 more wounds, one to his arm, another to his leg. The battle ends. He's on the winning side. But when he tries to walk to the camp, his legs give out. The cold has sapped his strength. The wounds have weakened him, and he falls in the snow. He tries to get up, but can't. His body temperature is already dropping. He watches his blood freeze in dark patches on the snow, watches his fingers turn white and then grey. The cold is taking him, shutting down his body one extremity at a time. He calls for help, but his companions are scattered, dealing with their own injuries, and in the chaos of post-battle reorganisation, no one hears him. He freezes to death 100 yards from the fires of his own camp, watching the smoke rise, unable to reach warmth that's tantalisingly close. It's hard not to reflect on how we see weather as mere backdrop in historical narratives, atmospheric detail rather than protagonist. But for Viking Age warriors fighting in winter, the cold was as much an enemy as the opposing army. Perhaps more so since it killed indiscriminately and gave no quarter. A summer wound might mean weeks of recovery. The same wound in winter often meant death from exposure before infection could even set in. The warriors who survived winter battles didn't just defeat human enemies. They survived nature itself, which claimed as many or more victims than enemy steel ever did. Chapter 12. Hand-to-hand reality. Grappling and brutality. Let us now examine what happened when shield walls broke down, and combat devolved into individual melees. This wasn't the choreographed swordplay of theatrical combat, but desperate, brutal fighting where warriors used any means available to survive. The elegant techniques of weapon mastery gave way to animal desperation. Grappling, wrestling, biting, gouging, using whatever worked to incapacitate or kill an opponent before he could do the same to you. When formations collapsed, warriors often lost their primary weapons. Shields splintered or were dropped in the confusion. Swords stuck in bodies or broke on impact with armour. Axes were knocked from hands. In these moments, fighting became a wrestling match with lethal stakes. Men grabbed at each other's clothing, tried to trip or throw opponents to the ground, used body weight and leverage to gain advantage. They punched with armoured fists, kicked with iron-reinforced boots, head-butted with helmets. They bit exposed flesh, ears, noses, fingers, anything to cause pain and create an opening. The ground in these melees was treacherous, mud churned by hundreds of feet, slick with blood, littered with dropped weapons and dead bodies that served as obstacles and tripping hazards. Going to the ground meant vulnerability, but avoiding it was nearly impossible in close-quarters chaos. Warriors rolled in the muck, grappling for position, trying to get on top where they could use gravity and weight advantage. The distinction between nobles and commoners vanished in this mud wrestling. Everyone became equally filthy, equally desperate. What made this truly horrifying was what archaeological evidence reveals about how these ground fights ended. Many skulls from Viking Age battle contexts show distinctive trauma patterns, multiple impacts from blunt objects, crushed facial bones, shattered orbital sockets. These weren't weapon wounds, these were injuries from being beaten to death with rocks, weapon pommels, helmets, whatever was at hand, while helpless on the ground. The finishing blow to a downed opponent wasn't delivered with an expensive sword that might get stuck in bone. It was delivered with a stone picked up from the churned earth, smashed repeatedly into the face and skull until the victim stopped moving. Some skeletal remains show even more disturbing evidence. Bite marks on bones. Human teeth marks where warriors had bitten opponents with enough force to reach bone. Noses and ears don't preserve archaeologically, but we can infer from the bite marks on jaws and cheekbones that ears and noses were bitten off during desperate fighting. Saga accounts occasionally mention warriors biting like dogs, which archaeological evidence now confirms was literal rather than metaphorical. Consider a nobleman, a jarl's son trained in weapon skills since childhood, proud of his fighting technique and expensive equipment. In the chaos of a breaking shield wall, he loses his sword. It's stuck in an enemy's ribs and he can't wrench it free before another attacker comes at him. He discards his shield to gain mobility, tries to draw his seax knife, but slips in the mud. He goes down. An enemy warrior, a farmer conscript with no training and no elegant technique, falls on top of him. They grapple, rolling in bloody mud, equally desperate. The nobleman tries to reach his knife, but the farmer has his arms pinned. So the farmer does what desperation demands. He bites the nobleman's face, tearing at his cheek, then finds a rock and begins smashing it into the nobleman's helmet. The helmet dents, then breaks. The rock finds skull. The nobleman dies ignobly, his face destroyed by a rock wielded by a man whose name he never learned, whose status was far beneath his own. His family receives his body days later, barely recognisable. The expensive armour doing nothing to prevent his skull from being caved in by a riverstone. So the next time you see choreographed medieval combat, all elegant sword techniques and respectful duelling, remember that real Viking Age combat often ended with desperate men wrestling in filth, using their hands and teeth and rocks to kill each other in ways that bore no resemblance to any warrior ideal. The animal desperation of survival overrode all training, all social status, all notions of honourable combat. When death was immediate and certain unless you acted, humans reverted to the most primitive violence imaginable, and the noblest warrior could die as ignobly as the poorest conscript. Chapter 13. The Duration, Exhaustion and Collapse. We must understand how long Viking Age battles actually lasted, because the reality contradicts our expectations shaped by epic narratives. Most battles were not hours-long affairs, but brief, intense bursts of violence lasting perhaps 20 to 30 minutes before participants were too exhausted to continue effective combat. The human body, especially when burdened with heavy equipment and operating under extreme stress, simply cannot maintain battle intensity for long periods. Modern military research has established clear limits on combat effectiveness. Soldiers in intense firefights experience dramatic performance degradation after just minutes. Fine motor skills decline, decision-making suffers, exhaustion sets in rapidly. Viking Age warriors faced similar if not greater constraints. They were engaged in maximum physical exertion, swinging heavy weapons, maintaining shield positions, pushing against enemy formations, while wearing significant armour weight and operating under extreme psychological stress. The energy expenditure was enormous. The first 5 to 10 minutes were probably the most intense. Initial clash, maximum adrenaline, both sides still fresh and aggressive. But adrenaline depletes quickly, and the physiological cost is severe. Hearts pound at unsustainable rates, breathing becomes laboured, muscles burn through oxygen and glucose. By 15 or 20 minutes into sustained combat, warriors were operating at significantly reduced capacity. Weapon swings became slower, less accurate. Footwork suffered. Reaction times lengthened. Men gasped for breath behind shields, barely able to hold position, no longer capable of aggressive action. What made this truly brutal was that battles didn't end cleanly when exhaustion set in. Instead, they entered a dangerous phase where men were too tired to fight effectively, but still in contact with enemies. This collapse period was when many casualties occurred. Exhausted warriors couldn't defend themselves properly, couldn't retreat quickly, couldn't even run if their formation broke. They stood or sat, heaving for breath, vulnerable to anyone with enough energy left to finish them. Archaeological evidence hints at this grim reality. Some skeletal remains show wound patterns consistent with being struck while unable to defend. Single killing blows to unprotected areas, suggesting victims who couldn't or didn't raise shields or dodge. Some show injuries clearly inflicted on people who were sitting or kneeling, based on the angle of weapon strikes. These warriors hadn't surrendered or chosen to rest. They'd simply reached the physical limit of exhaustion and become easy targets. Picture a warrior in his late 20s, in good physical condition, fighting in a shield wall at a Danish border conflict. The formations meet with tremendous force. He fights hard for the first 10 minutes, blocks strikes with his shield, delivers his own attacks, maintains position. By 15 minutes his arms are burning, his shield feels impossibly heavy, his breath comes in ragged gasps. By 20 minutes he's barely keeping his shield up, no longer attacking, just trying to survive. The formations separate slightly, both sides equally exhausted, neither able to maintain the press. He collapses where he stands, sitting down heavily, his shield falling beside him, his sword still in his hand but his arm too tired to lift it. He sits there, trying to breathe, trying to recover some strength, watching the other exhausted warriors around him doing the same. He doesn't see the enemy warrior, equally exhausted but with just enough energy left for one more action, approach from his blind side. He doesn't have the energy to react when the axe comes down. He dies sitting in the mud, too tired to even try to defend himself, killed not because he lacked skill or courage, but because his body had simply used up all its available energy. His muscles literally couldn't respond to his brain's commands anymore. It's worth remembering that movie battles rage on for extended sequences, with heroes fighting fresh and strong for as long as the plot demands. Real humans hit a wall of exhaustion with brutal speed. Viking Age warriors weren't superhuman. They were farmers and craftsmen and traders who occasionally picked up weapons. They became exhausted quickly, and exhaustion killed as surely as enemy weapons. The battle wasn't won by the most skilled fighters, but by whoever had any energy left when the other side had none. Survival often came down to simple endurance, being able to lift your shield one more time, take one more step, deliver one more blow when everyone around you was too tired to continue. Chapter 14, Facial Wounds, Horror of Disfigurement. Let us examine one of the most disturbing categories of Viking Age battle injuries, facial trauma. Archaeological analysis of skeletal remains from warrior contexts reveals an unusually high frequency of injuries to the face and skull, and these wounds tell stories of particular horror because they weren't immediately fatal. Warriors who suffered severe facial injuries often survived, living years or decades with terrible disfigurement in a society that had limited means to help them and often stigmatized visible difference. The face was vulnerable in Viking Age combat for specific tactical reasons. The standard fighting position involved holding a shield at roughly chest height, with the helmet protecting the top and back of the head. This left a gap, the area from the nose to the jawline, partially exposed, especially during the dynamic movement of combat when shield positions shifted. Enemy warriors targeted this gap deliberately with overhead strikes, horizontal slashes and thrusting attacks. A blow that caught the lower face might miss the skull's protective bone but destroy the soft tissue, teeth and jaw structure. Skeletal evidence shows the brutal specificity of these injuries. Shattered jaws where sword strikes had split the mandible completely. Missing teeth knocked out by weapon impact, sometimes entire rows of them. Crushed eye sockets where helmet rims had been driven into the face by weapon strikes. Facial bones showing deep cuts that healed but left permanent deformities. A nose split by a sword edge, cheekbones fractured and misaligned. Some remains show multiple facial injuries that healed at different times, suggesting warriors who survived one disfiguring wound only to suffer another in a subsequent battle. What made facial disfigurement particularly horrific was the social consequences in Viking Age society. This was a culture that valued appearance and wholeness. Physical beauty was associated with good character. Deformity was often seen as a mark of bad luck or divine disfavour. Saga literature frequently mentions characters' physical appearance, and those with facial disfigurement were often given cruel nicknames. Split nose, one eye, jaw crooked. These weren't affectionate terms, but markers of otherness and diminished status. The practical consequences were equally severe. A destroyed jaw meant difficulty eating and speaking. Many warriors with jaw injuries would have been limited to soft foods, unable to bite or chew, possibly unable to speak clearly. In a society where communal feasting was central to social bonding and verbal communication was essential, these disabilities effectively isolated survivors from normal social life. Missing noses caused not just aesthetic disfigurement, but breathing difficulties. Lost eyes meant reduced battlefield effectiveness and difficulty with depth perception in daily life. These weren't just cosmetic injuries, but life-altering disabilities. Consider a warrior in his early 20s, fighting in a raid on England. A sword strike catches him across the face, splitting his jaw and destroying most of his teeth on one side. He survives. The blood loss is manageable, the wound eventually scabs over, infection doesn't take hold. He lives, but his jaw heals crooked, his mouth won't close properly, he drools constantly, and eating solid food is impossible. His speech becomes slurred and difficult to understand. When he returns home, people turn away from his appearance. Children stare and cry. Women avoid him. His wife, who married a handsome young warrior, now shares a home with a disfigured stranger who can barely speak. He finds himself excluded from feasts. His appearance disturbs other guests, and he can't eat the food anyway. He sits alone, his battlefield survival having condemned him to social death. Some skeletal evidence suggests even darker outcomes. Remains showing severe healed facial trauma sometimes also show signs of poor overall health in their final years. Malnutrition markers, evidence of secondary infections, bone changes consistent with chronic illness. These warriors survived their wounds but may have lived shortened, impoverished lives, their disfigurement preventing them from working effectively or maintaining social connections that could have supported them. So the next time you see a movie character receive a dramatic facial scar that only makes them look more rugged and attractive, remember the reality was devastating disfigurement that destroyed social identity. Viking Age warriors who survived facial trauma didn't become mysterious, attractive anti-heroes. They became objects of pity or revulsion, struggling to eat and speak, excluded from the communal life that defined their culture, living with the constant physical reminder that their survival was, in some ways, a punishment worse than death. The face was not just flesh and bone, but identity itself, and destroying it destroyed the person in ways that death might have been kinder to spare. Chapter 15. The Role of Luck. Arbitrary death, picture if you will. The uncomfortable reality that survival in Viking Age battles depended far less on skill, courage, or expensive equipment than on pure random chance. This truth contradicted the warrior culture's fundamental narratives about valour and ability, yet the archaeological and historical evidence makes it undeniable. Where you stood in the formation, which way an arrow tumbled through air, whether you slipped at a crucial moment, these arbitrary factors decided life and death far more than any warrior training. Consider the projectile phase of battle. When hundreds or thousands of arrows, spears and stones fill the sky, there was no skill involved in survival. You raised your shield and hoped. An arrow meant for your neighbour might deflect off his helmet and continue into your neck. A spear thrown blindly from 60 yards away might travel in a perfect arc to find the one gap in your shield's protection. You could be the finest warrior in Scandinavia, with decades of experience and perfect technique, and still die from a random stone that cracked your skull before you'd even seen an enemy up close. The shield wall itself was a lottery of position. The front rank faced the most immediate danger, but at least could see threats coming. The middle ranks died from overhead projectiles they never saw. The back ranks were relatively safe, unless the formation broke, in which case they were often the last to know and the most disorganised in retreat. Where your commander placed you in formation, itself often arbitrary, based on when you arrived or who you knew, determined your survival odds far more than your combat ability. Even in melee combat, luck dominated. A warrior might choose to engage one opponent instead of another, not knowing that the man he avoided had a cracked shield that would have failed on first impact while the man he fought had fresh equipment. You might survive a sword strike because you'd bent slightly to adjust your boot a second before the blow came, the chance movement saving your life. Or you might die because you stepped on a stone that rolled under your foot, causing you to stumble into an enemy spear. These weren't decisions or skills, they were random chance operating at every moment. What made this truly unsettling was what it revealed about social hierarchies. Viking Age culture insisted that chieftains and jarls were better warriors, that their status reflected superior ability. They certainly had better equipment, expensive mail, quality swords, well-made shields, but archaeological analysis of mass graves shows no correlation between equipment quality and survival rates. Kings and slaves died side by side with similar wounds. The expensive armour didn't actually improve survival odds significantly, because the injuries that killed were often wounds that penetrated any armour, or projectiles that struck exposed areas, or simple exhaustion that affected everyone equally. Some mass grave sites show this democratic nature of battlefield death particularly clearly. Wealthy warriors identifiable by their grave goods buried alongside poor conscripts identifiable by their lack of equipment. The wealthy warriors' bodies showing just as many wounds, just as much trauma as the poorest fighters. Their social advantages, their training, their equipment, their confident belief in their superior warrior status bought them nothing when random arrows fell or when they happened to stand in the section of shield wall that took the enemy's main push. There's a renowned warrior in the saga literature, details change to protect historical complexity. Known for skill and courage, victor of a dozen battles, owner of a named sword feared by enemies across Scandinavia. He stands in a shield wall at a riverside conflict, his expensive mail gleaming, his sword ready, his heart confident. An arrow, shot wildly by a barely trained farmhand in the enemy line who'd never held a bow before this campaign, tumbles through its arc, wobbling because the farmhand couldn't draw the bow properly. The arrow, more by accident than aim, finds the tiny gap between the warrior's mail collar and helmet. It punches through his throat, severing the artery. He drowns in his own blood in less than a minute. Beside him, his shield-bearer, a young man of no particular skill fighting his first battle with borrowed equipment, survives without a scratch because no projectile happened to find him. The renowned warrior dies randomly. The novice survives randomly. Skill and status meant nothing. We can scarcely imagine accepting this randomness, this fundamental injustice of survival. Humans need to believe that good things happen for good reasons, that skill and virtue are rewarded, that our actions matter. The warrior culture created elaborate narratives about valour and ability precisely to obscure this uncomfortable truth. But the bones don't lie. Viking Age battles killed indiscriminately, rewarded luck over skill, and made a mockery of every belief about warrior prowess determining survival. The battlefield was chaos, and chaos has no favourites, respects no hierarchy, and kills the skilled as readily as the novice when chance decides their moment has come. Chapter 16, Naval Combat, Drowning in Armour. Let us now turn to a particular horror of Viking Age warfare: combat on ships and in coastal waters. The Norse were famous as seafarers, and many battles occurred on or near water, ship-to-ship engagements, beach landings, fights in harbours and river mouths. These maritime battles added a specific terror beyond normal combat: the constant threat of drowning while wearing equipment that made swimming impossible and sinking inevitable. Ship-to-ship combat followed predictable patterns. Vessels would come alongside each other, crews would lash them together to create a stable fighting platform, and warriors would battle across the gunwales and between ships. The vessels rocked with every movement, making footing treacherous. Blood and seawater made decks slippery. The constant motion meant warriors were fighting while also struggling to maintain balance, which added exhaustion and increased the likelihood of missteps. Falling overboard was a death sentence for armoured warriors. Mail shirts weighed 30 to 40 pounds. Helmets added more weight. Weapons, shields, leather padding under the mail, all of it combined to make a warrior significantly heavier than water. If you went over the side, you sank. Not slowly, not with time to struggle free of equipment, but immediately and irreversibly. The weight pulled you straight down, and in the cold waters of the North Atlantic or Baltic, you had perhaps minutes before hypothermia rendered you unconscious, even if you somehow managed to stay afloat. Archaeological evidence confirms this horror. Harbour excavations and underwater archaeological sites have discovered warrior remains in coastal waters, still wearing their armour. Some were found with weapons still in hand or strapped to their bodies. These weren't warriors who removed their equipment and drowned later. They went into the water armoured and sank where they fell. Some remains show signs of desperate struggle. Scratch marks on shield bosses where drowning men clawed for something to hold on to. Fingers frozen in grasping positions. Bodies found in contorted postures suggesting final panic. The psychological terror of drowning while armoured is difficult to overstate. You hit the water and immediately begin sinking. Your instinct is to swim, but the weight makes any swimming motion futile. You try to remove your mail, but it's fitted over your head and requires both hands and careful manoeuvring to take off. Impossible while sinking and panicking. The helmet might come off if you can work the straps, but the mail shirt won't. Your shield is strapped to your arm. Removing it requires unbuckling straps with numb, frantic fingers. Every second you spend trying to shed equipment is a second you're sinking deeper. Your lungs burning, the surface growing more distant above you. Imagine a warrior fighting on a longship in a North Sea battle, late spring when the water is still lethally cold. The ships are lashed together, the fighting is intense. He's focused on the enemy in front of him when someone shoves him from behind. Maybe accidentally, maybe deliberately, it doesn't matter. He loses his balance on the blood-slick deck, tips over the gunwale and hits the water. The cold is an immediate shock that steals his breath. The weight pulls him under before he can even try to swim. He's sinking, watching the hull of his ship recede above him through increasingly dark water. He claws at his mail, trying to get it off, but his fingers won't work properly in the cold water. His lungs are screaming for air. He tries to kick toward the surface, but the mail makes him sink faster than his legs can propel him upward. The last thing he sees is the dark shadow of ship hulls above him, unreachably far, and then the cold water fills his lungs and everything goes dark. Some coastal battle sites show evidence of mass drowning events. Areas near shores where battles occurred have yielded multiple armoured remains in relatively small areas, suggesting that when shield walls broke or ships capsized, many warriors entered the water simultaneously. They would have watched each other drown, unable to help, each man struggling individually against the same physics that made survival impossible. The waters near some Viking Age battle sites became mass graves, the seafloor littered with armoured warriors who sank and stayed there, their bones eventually scattered by currents, but their equipment remaining where it fell. So the next time you see an epic naval battle, in which armoured warriors fight aboard ships with no apparent concern for the water, remember the reality. The sea was as much an enemy as any opposing warrior, and it killed with cold efficiency. A warrior could survive a dozen land battles only to drown in his first naval engagement, pulled under by the very equipment that was supposed to protect him. The irony was cruel. The mail that might stop a sword couldn't be removed fast enough to prevent drowning, making your best protection your executioner the moment you hit the water. Chapter 17. Post-battle looting. Violence continues. We must examine what happened in the immediate aftermath of Viking Age battles, because the violence didn't end when the formations broke and one side fled or surrendered. What followed was systematic looting of the dead and dying, a practice that was both economically essential and brutally violent. Understanding this phase reveals how warfare extended beyond the clash of arms into calculated murder of the helpless. Looting was fundamental to Viking Age warfare economics. Warriors often weren't paid regular wages, but compensated themselves through plunder. A dead enemy warrior represented significant wealth. Mail shirts were expensive and could be resold or reused. Swords were valuable. Shields and helmets had worth. Even clothing and boots could be stripped and sold. After a battle, the victors moved through the field systematically, stripping everything of value from the fallen. This wasn't dishonourable or unusual. It was expected practice that everyone understood and anticipated. But looting wasn't just taking from the dead, it also involved dealing with the wounded. Wounded enemy warriors represented potential future enemies who might recover and fight again. They also represented mouths to feed if taken prisoner, which created economic burdens, and wounded men wearing valuable equipment were easier to loot if they were dead rather than struggling or pleading. The practical solution was simple and brutal. Kill the wounded during the looting phase. Archaeological evidence strongly suggests this practice was widespread. Many skeletal remains from Viking Age battle contexts show what forensic archaeologists call post-mortem trauma, injuries inflicted after or around the time of death that weren't the cause of death. These include throat cuts on bodies that died from other wounds, skull fractures delivered to already dead or dying individuals, and patterns suggesting wounded men were dispatched while lying, helpless on the ground. Some remains show defensive wounds followed by execution-style trauma, a man who died trying to protect himself from a finishing blow delivered while he was already incapacitated. The efficiency of this killing was systematic. Victorious warriors moved through the aftermath in groups, checking bodies, stripping equipment, and ensuring no enemies survived to cause future problems. Throats were cut, a quick, reliable method that required no special skill. Skulls were struck with whatever weapon was handy, often the same weapons that had been used in combat, now employed in cold execution rather than hot battle. Some saga accounts matter-of-factly mention clearing the field, or making sure of the fallen, euphemisms for this post-battle murder. Some mass grave excavations reveal particularly disturbing evidence. Bodies stripped completely naked, every piece of equipment and clothing taken, leaving corpses exposed. This nakedness wasn't about disrespect, it was about economic efficiency. Everything had value, everything could be reused or sold. But the stripping also meant handling corpses, turning them over, moving limbs to access straps and buckles. The combination of looting and killing created scenes of methodical brutality that contrasted sharply with the chaos of battle itself. This wasn't hot-blooded combat, but cold-blooded exploitation. Picture a young warrior wounded in a shield wall clash somewhere in northern France. He's taken a spear thrust to his abdomen, not immediately fatal but serious, painful, bleeding steadily. When his line breaks and his companions flee, he can't run. He lies in the churned mud, hands pressed to his wound, trying to slow the bleeding. He hears the victorious enemy approaching, checking bodies, and he knows what's coming. He tries to plead when a warrior stands over him, but his voice is weak. He tries to offer his sword as ransom, but the looter is already reaching for it. The warrior doesn't waste time on negotiation. An axe comes down, a single practical blow to the neck, and the young man's pleading stops. The looter continues stripping the body, mailshirt, boots, belt, knife, even the woolen tunic underneath. He works efficiently without emotion, as his companions do the same across the field. This isn't murder in his mind, it's simply completing the job started in battle. It's worth remembering that we often see movies cut from battle to victory celebrations, erasing this intermediate phase entirely. We don't see the methodical killing of wounded enemies, the stripping of corpses, the calculated decisions to murder rather than capture or spare. But this was standard practice in Viking Age warfare, understood by all participants as part of the battle's economics. Mercy was expensive, death was profitable. Compassion created future enemies, execution eliminated them. The battlefield became a place of transaction where human life was currency, spent freely to maximise profit and minimise future risk. Chapter 18. Infection. The slow killer. Let us examine the medical reality that awaited warriors who survived the actual fighting. Even those who walked off battlefields apparently victorious over their injuries faced a massive, invisible threat. Infection. In an age without antibiotics, without proper understanding of bacteria, without effective antiseptic techniques, even minor wounds could prove fatal. The battlefield didn't stop killing when the combat ended. It continued claiming victims for days, weeks, sometimes months afterward. Every battlefield wound was contaminated. Weapons passed through multiple bodies, picking up bacteria with each strike. They dragged fabric from clothing into wounds, introducing textile fibres that carried their own bacterial load. Wounds sustained on the ground, common in fallen warriors, were contaminated with soil bacteria including Clostridium tetani, which causes tetanus, and various species that cause gas gangrene. The battlefield environment itself was a bacterial nightmare. Churned mud mixed with blood, feces, vomit, decomposing bodies, all creating conditions where pathogens thrived. The progression of infection followed predictable patterns. Within hours, wounds became inflamed, red, swollen, increasingly painful. Pus formation began within a day or two as the body attempted to fight infection. Some cultures believed pus was a good sign, laudable pus that indicated healing, not understanding that it actually represented ongoing bacterial infection. Fever followed, the body's attempt to kill bacteria with heat, which weakened warriors already traumatized by injury and blood loss. Without antibiotics, the body's immune system fought alone, and often it lost. What made infection particularly brutal was the specific forms it took. Gangrene developed when bacteria killed tissue faster than blood supply could nourish it. Flesh literally rotted while still attached to the living body. The affected area turned black, developed a distinctive foul smell that medieval sources describe with horror, and caused systemic poisoning as decomposition products entered the bloodstream. Gas gangrene was even worse. Bacteria produced gas pockets in tissue, causing visible bubbling under skin and creating crepitus. a crackling sound when the infected area was touched. Tetanus caused muscle spasms so severe that backs arched unnaturally and jaws locked shut, hence the common name lockjaw, eventually causing death through respiratory failure or exhaustion from constant seizures. Archaeological evidence shows that many warriors survived battle wounds only to die from infection days or weeks later. Skeletal remains show wounds that had begun healing. New bone growth at fracture sites, bone remodelling around cut edges, alongside evidence of systemic infection. Bone changes characteristic of chronic infection, periosteal reactions where infections spread to bone tissue itself, and sometimes evidence of desperate medical interventions. Some remains show crude amputations, limbs sawed off in attempts to stop infection from spreading. Most of these amputations would have killed the patient from shock and blood loss, but the attempts reveal how serious infection threats were understood to be. Treatment options were limited and largely ineffective. Wounds were washed with whatever was available, often contaminated water that introduced more bacteria. Poultices of herbs were applied based on tradition rather than effectiveness. Some treatments actually worsened outcomes. Cauterizing wounds with hot iron added burn trauma to bacterial contamination. Amputation, when attempted, was performed without anesthesia beyond alcohol or herbal sedatives, without sterile technique, and with tools that hadn't been properly cleaned. The cure was often as deadly as the infection. Consider a warrior who survives a battle in Ireland with a sword cut to his leg. Not a major wound, missing arteries and bones, bleeding controllably. He's proud to have survived, expects to heal and fight again. Within 2 days his leg is swollen and hot to touch. Pus drains from the wound. Fever makes him confused and weak. By day 4 the flesh around the wound is turning dark, developing the distinctive stench of gangrene. The camp healer attempts to treat it with poultices, but the infection is in his blood now, spreading through his body faster than any medieval treatment can stop. By day 7, he's delirious with fever, his leg black up to the knee, the infection causing system-wide sepsis. He dies on day 9, not from the sword wound that seemed survivable, but from bacteria invisible to his healers, unstoppable with their limited knowledge. His companions bury him, and remember he died from his wounds in battle, not understanding that he died from a medical condition that modern antibiotics could have cured in days. So the next time you see a movie character receive wounds and then continue adventuring without medical consequences, remember that reality was far less forgiving. Most Viking Age battle deaths probably occurred after the battle itself, in the slow, agonizing process of infection, overwhelming bodies that had survived the initial trauma. The battlefield's killing didn't end when swords stopped swinging. It continued in invisible microscopic warfare that claimed as many or more victims than visible violence, and offered deaths that were slower, more painful, and just as inevitable as any wound dealt in the heat of combat. Chapter 19. Forced conscription. Unwilling warriors. Picture, if you will, the uncomfortable truth that many Viking Age warriors weren't eager volunteers seeking glory, but conscripted farmers and labourers forced into service. The romantic image of the enthusiastic Norse warrior choosing battle and adventure obscures the reality that armies were filled through legal obligations and social coercion. Understanding this, forced participation reveals how Viking Age warfare exploited the powerless and created armies of reluctant, poorly prepared fighters. The lading system in Scandinavia formalised military obligations. Coastal regions were divided into ship districts, each required to provide and crew a warship when the king or jarl called for military service. This wasn't optional, it was law, backed by severe penalties for refusal. Each household within the district owed either a man for the crew or money to hire a substitute. Poor families who couldn't afford substitutes sent whoever they could spare, often the youngest able-bodied male, sometimes boys as young as 13 or 14. Similar conscription systems operated across Viking-influenced regions. When a chieftain called for warriors, local farmers and craftsmen were obligated to appear with weapons and minimal equipment. They might receive a few days or weeks of training before campaigns, but many went to battle with barely any preparation beyond knowing which end of a spear to hold forward. Their expertise was in farming or fishing or woodworking, not warfare. They became warriors not by choice but by geographical accident of living within a chieftain's territory. The penalties for refusing military service were severe enough to coerce participation even from those who desperately wanted to avoid fighting. Outlawry was a common punishment, being declared outside legal protection, fair game for killing, one's property confiscated. This effectively destroyed not just the individual but his entire family, who lost their provider and protector. Some legal codes mention execution for persistent refusal, especially during urgent military needs. Communities sometimes enforced conscription through social pressure. Families whose men refused service were shamed, excluded, or worse. What made forced conscription particularly dark was its creation of armies filled with terrified, unwilling participants. These men weren't motivated by glory or adventure, but by fear of punishment for refusing. They didn't want to be on battlefields, but had no legal escape. Their reluctance showed in combat. Saga accounts mention warriors who hung back, who fled at first opportunity, who fought poorly because their hearts weren't in the violence. Some archaeological evidence may reflect this. Remains of young warriors with wounds suggesting they died trying to flee rather than fighting. Perhaps conscripts who broke under the stress of their first real combat. Some sources hint at even darker enforcement. Execution sites near mustering points where deserters or refusing conscripts were killed as examples to others. Saga passages mention chieftains who killed their own men for cowardice or refusal to fight. The message was clear. You might die in battle, but you would certainly die if you refused to go. For poor farmers with families depending on them, there was no good choice, only the terrible gamble that maybe they'd survive warfare while certain punishment awaited refusal. Consider a farmer in his late 20s, somewhere in Norway, late 10th century. He has a wife, 2 young children, elderly parents living with him. His farm is small but productive enough to feed his family. When the local Jarl calls for men to join a raid across the North Sea, this farmer is obligated to go. He doesn't want to. He's never fought anyone, has no desire for glory or plunder, fears leaving his family vulnerable during his absence. But refusing means outlawry, which means his family loses everything. So he goes, carrying a borrowed spear and wearing no armour because he can't afford any. He's given 3 days of training, how to stand in formation, how to thrust a spear, basic commands. Then he's on a ship, seasick and terrified, crossing to England for a conflict he doesn't understand or care about. When the battle comes, he's paralysed with fear in the shield wall. He survives not through skill, but because he happened to stand in a part of the formation that saw light fighting. He returns home, traumatised, and finds his farm has suffered from his absence. 2 years later, another call comes. He has to go again. This time he's not so lucky. It's worth remembering that we often romanticise Viking warriors as if they were all eager participants in a warrior culture. The reality included countless men like this farmer, forced into service, unprepared, unwilling, dying or being traumatised in battles they never wanted to fight. The glorious narrative of Norse warrior culture was built partly on the backs of terrified conscripts who had no choice but to participate in a system that valued their compliance more than their lives. When we celebrate Viking military achievements, we often erase these unwilling participants whose forced labour made those achievements possible. Chapter 20. Psychological Trauma, No Valhalla for the Broken. Let us now examine perhaps the most invisible wound of Viking Age warfare, psychological trauma. Modern medicine recognises combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder as a serious condition requiring treatment and support. Viking Age culture had no such framework. Warriors who survived battles but returned psychologically damaged faced a society that had no language to describe their suffering, no treatment to offer, and often no sympathy for invisible wounds. The evidence for psychological trauma in Viking Age sources is fragmentary but suggestive. Saga literature occasionally mentions warriors who changed after battles, becoming violent and unpredictable, unable to settle, prone to sudden rages or profound withdrawals. Some sources describe warriors who couldn't sleep properly afterward, who woke screaming, who became difficult or troublesome in ways that suggest trauma symptoms. The language isn't clinical, but the patterns match what we now recognise as PTSD, intrusive memories, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, difficulty, readjusting to civilian life. The triggers were obvious. Killing another human being, especially up close in hand-to-hand combat, creates lasting psychological impact. Watching friends die horribly, being unable to help them, surviving when others didn't, these experiences burden survivors with guilt and grief. The sensory memories, sounds, smells, sights of battle could be triggered by innocuous stimuli in daily life. A feast where metal cups clatter might trigger memories of weapons clashing. The smell of butchered animals might recall the smell of opened human bodies. These triggers could cause panic, rage, or withdrawal in warriors who had no framework to understand what was happening to them. What made psychological trauma particularly brutal in Viking Age society was the cultural expectation of stoic warrior masculinity. Men were expected to be strong, unemotional, capable. Showing fear or distress was shameful. Warriors who struggled psychologically after battles had few options. They couldn't admit to nightmares without seeming weak. They couldn't seek help for invisible wounds when the culture only recognised physical injuries as valid. Many likely suffered in silence, trying to maintain the warrior ideal, even as their mental health deteriorated. Some archaeological and textual evidence suggests tragic outcomes. Certain skeletal remains show injuries consistent with self-inflicted trauma, though this interpretation is necessarily uncertain. Saga passages occasionally mention warriors who died in unclear circumstances after returning from campaigns, or who engaged in increasingly reckless behaviour that might represent suicidal ideation. Some sources mention warriors who became hermits, or withdrew from society, possibly because they couldn't handle social reintegration after traumatic experiences. The cultural framework of Valhalla, the hall where warriors who died in battle would feast eternally, provided meaning for combat death, but nothing for traumatized survivors. If you died fighting, you were honoured and remembered. If you survived but returned psychologically broken, you were simply broken. The culture that demanded you face death courageously had no compassion for the parts of you that death broke without killing. Consider a warrior in his early 30s who's fought in 5 or 6 campaigns. In his last battle he killed a young warrior in hand-to-hand combat, a boy really, maybe 16 years old, who reminded him of his own younger brother. The boy's face as he died haunts him. At night, he wakes from dreams where he's the one dying, or where he kills his actual brother, or where the dead boy pursues him endlessly. He startles violently at sudden noises. He can't attend feasts because the crowded hall feels threatening, everyone a potential enemy. He snaps angrily at his family over nothing. He drinks heavily to numb the memories, which makes everything worse. His community doesn't understand. They say he should be proud. He fought well, survived, helped win victories. They tell him to move on, to be strong. His wife grows frustrated with his moods and withdrawals. His children fear his sudden angers. He has no words to explain what's wrong because his culture gave him no language for it. He's just troubled or changed, labels that isolate rather than help. He considers death increasingly often, seeing it as the only escape from memories that won't stop. Years after his last battle, he dies, perhaps accidentally, perhaps deliberately, and people remember him as a good warrior whose later life was somehow disappointing, never understanding that the battles broke something in him that never healed. So the next time you see a movie warrior walk away from combat apparently unaffected, Remember that real humans carry psychological wounds that outlast physical injuries. Viking Age culture created and celebrated warriors, but had no space for those warriors when battle broke their minds rather than their bodies. The trauma of combat didn't fit the narrative of glorious warfare, so it was ignored, minimised, or blamed on individual weakness. Warriors suffered alone, unable to speak their truth in a culture that insisted they should be strong enough to simply endure whatever war demanded of them. The battlefield claimed casualties long after the fighting ended, and some of the most devastating wounds were the ones that nobody could see. Chapter 21. The Aftermath. Field of Corpses. Imagine the scene several hours after a Viking Age battle has ended. The fighting is over, one side has fled or been destroyed, and what remains is a landscape transformed into something nightmarish. Hundreds or thousands of bodies lie scattered across the churned earth, many still in the positions where they fell. The wounded who haven't been killed during looting cry out for help, for water, for mercy. Scavengers, both human and animal, begin appearing, drawn by the smell of blood and death. The sheer scale of carnage is difficult to comprehend from our sanitised modern perspective. A major battle might leave 500 to 2,000 dead, concentrated in a relatively small area, perhaps a few acres where the main fighting occurred. Bodies lay in heaps where shield walls collapsed, scattered across fields where warriors fled and were cut down, floating in streams or shorelines where naval combat occurred. The ground was torn up from thousands of feet, slick with blood that mixed with mud and created a distinctive reddish-brown paste. Dropped weapons and shattered shields littered the field. The air was thick with flies, already gathering to lay eggs in wounds and corpses. The victors faced an enormous logistical problem: what to do with all these bodies. In some cases, particularly when fighting on foreign soil, the answer was simple and brutal: nothing. Bodies were left where they fell to rot, becoming a public health hazard. Archaeological evidence from some Viking Age battle sites shows remained scattered across wide areas, bones partially buried or not buried at all, suggesting minimal or no organised disposal. Bodies left exposed were scavenged by dogs, pigs, ravens and other animals, which scattered bones and partially consumed corpses. What made battlefield aftermath particularly horrifying was the timeline of decomposition. In warm weather, bodies began bloating within hours from bacterial gas production. Within a day, visible decomposition became obvious: skin discolouring, fluids leaking from orifices, the distinctive smell of decay becoming overwhelming. By day 3, bodies were significantly decomposed, making handling them unpleasant and dangerous work. Diseases could spread from the corpses to the living, contaminating water sources and creating epidemic conditions among survivors and local populations. Some battlefields received more organised treatment. Mass graves were dug, large pits into which bodies were thrown without ceremony or individual burial. Archaeological excavations of these mass graves revealed disturbing details. Bodies piled haphazardly, no attention to positioning or dignity, sometimes showing evidence of being thrown in while still alive but too wounded to protest. Some graves show bodies stripped naked before burial, every piece of useful material already taken. Others show partial burial where bodies were covered with minimal earth that later washed away, leaving bones exposed again. The work of clearing battlefields fell to the lower status individuals and sometimes to the local population if fighting occurred on inhabited land. This was grim, traumatic labour, dragging decomposing bodies, breathing the stench of death, handling your dead friends and relatives if you were on the losing side. Some sources mention forced labour, compelling defeated populations to bury the victor's enemies. The psychological toll of this work was never acknowledged, but handling hundreds of rotting corpses while knowing they might have been your neighbours or family members must have created lasting trauma. Picture a local farmer forced to help clear a battlefield that crossed his land. The fighting ended 2 days ago. The bodies have been lying in summer heat for 48 hours. He's given a cart and told to collect the dead. He finds warriors he knew, men from his village who were conscripted to fight. Their bodies are swollen, stinking, covered with insects. Some have been partially eaten by animals during the night. He has to load them onto his cart, their decomposing flesh sometimes coming away in his hands. The smell is so overwhelming he vomits repeatedly but can't stop working. His land, his fields where he grew crops to feed his family, are now a mass grave. He knows the soil is contaminated with blood and decomposition. He wonders if anything will grow here again, if the water from his well is safe to drink. Years later, he still finds bones when he ploughs, still smells that distinctive stench of decay when the wind blows from certain directions. Some archaeological evidence suggests that not all battlefields were ever properly cleared. Battle sites near water sources show evidence of disease outbreaks in subsequent years. Skeletal remains from nearby settlements showing patterns consistent with waterborne illness, likely from corpse contamination of streams and wells. The battlefield's killing continued long after the fighting ended, claiming civilians who simply had the misfortune to live near where warriors decided to settle their disputes. So the next time you see a movie end with the victory celebration, cutting cleanly from battle to triumph, remember that someone had to clear the field of corpses. Someone had to dig the pits, drag the bodies, breathe the smell of mass death. Communities near battlefields lived with the contamination for years, bone fragments surfacing in fields, water sources tainted, diseases spreading from improper disposal. The battle itself might last an hour, but its physical aftermath could poison the landscape and population for years. The dead didn't simply disappear when the narrative moved on. They rotted where they fell, creating nightmares for the living who had to continue existing in a place transformed into a charnel ground. Chapter 22. Communication Breakdown. Isolated combat. Let us examine how Viking Age battles became fragmented chaos once fighting commenced, creating conditions where commanders lost control and individual warriors fought in isolated bubbles of awareness. This communication breakdown transformed organised formations into confusion, making friendly fire casualties inevitable and reducing battles to hundreds of individual struggles happening simultaneously without coordination. Before battle, commanders could issue orders, organise formations, create tactical plans. But once shield walls met and combat intensified, verbal communication became nearly impossible. The noise level, thousands of men screaming, weapons clashing, wounded crying out, made hearing anyone beyond a few feet extraordinarily difficult. Commanders might shout orders that nobody heard. Banner signals might be missed in the visual chaos of combat. Horns and drums could sound signals, but their meaning could be misinterpreted or simply not heard over the general din. Visibility collapsed once fighting began. In a shield wall you could see only the immediate enemies in front of you, and the comrades directly beside you. Everything beyond your immediate radius, perhaps 10 or 15 feet, was obscured by bodies, shields, dust or mud kicked up by movement, and the simple fact that you were focused intensely on not dying. You had no idea how the overall battle was progressing, whether your side was winning or losing, whether your formation was still intact or had fragmented. You fought in ignorance, making split-second decisions based on incomplete information about threats you could see, while being unaware of threats you couldn't. This isolation meant that battles quickly fractured into countless individual melees. What started as organised formation warfare dissolved into personal struggles. Warriors who became separated from their units had no way to find them again in the chaos. Groups of friends or family members might stick together, creating small pockets of coordinated fighting within the larger disorganisation. But most warriors fought essentially alone, their awareness limited to immediate threats and opportunities, unable to contribute to or benefit from any larger tactical picture. What made this communication breakdown particularly dangerous was the inevitability of friendly fire. When you couldn't see who was around you, couldn't hear commands, couldn't distinguish friend from foe in the chaos, you struck at any threat. Archaeological evidence supports this grim reality. Skeletal remains showing wounds that came from unexpected directions. Strikes from behind or from the side that couldn't have come from the enemy front line. Some remains show arrow or spear wounds with trajectories indicating they came from friendly positions. The equipment similarity made misidentification easy. Both sides often wore similar armour, carried similar shields, used similar weapons. In the heat and confusion of battle, with adrenaline pumping and split-second decisions required, warriors struck at movement without taking time to verify targets. A warrior turning to face a new threat might accidentally strike a comrade. An axe swung wildly in melee might find a friendly skull. Projectiles launched into a mixed melee couldn't discriminate between friend and foe. Saga accounts occasionally acknowledge this reality, though usually obliquely. References to warriors killed in the confusion or by mischance sometimes suggest friendly fire incidents that couldn't be openly acknowledged without undermining warrior culture's narratives about skill and honour. Some sources mention warriors who killed kinsmen by accident during battles, likely referring to these chaotic misidentification deaths. Consider two brothers fighting in a shield wall somewhere in England, mid-10th century. The elder brother is experienced, has fought in several battles. The younger is in his first major combat. The shield wall meets, and the chaos begins. The brothers are separated almost immediately. The elder pushed forward by the press of bodies, the younger held back in a secondary rank. Minutes pass in desperate fighting. The elder brother turns to check on his younger brother, sees a figure coming at him from the side, indistinct through the chaos, weapon raised. His instinct and training take over. He strikes with his axe, catches the figure across the neck. The person falls. Only then, in a brief moment of clearing, does he see it's his younger brother, wearing the same style of helmet, carrying the same type of shield, indistinguishable in the chaos from any other warrior. The younger brother dies from his own brother's blow, delivered in the confusion of battle without recognition or intent. The elder brother has to live with this knowledge for the rest of his life. He can't admit what happened. His family would never understand or forgive. So he claims his brother died fighting enemies, died bravely, died honourably. He bears the secret guilt alone, another invisible wound of warfare that his culture has no space to acknowledge. His brother's death isn't counted as friendly fire or accident, but as a glorious battle death, and the elder brother must participate in honouring a killing he himself committed. It's hard not to reflect on how our depictions of medieval battle show clear sides, easy identification, coordinated action under wise commanders. The reality was blind chaos, where warriors had no idea what was happening beyond their immediate surroundings, where communication was impossible, where friends killed friends without knowing it. Battles weren't organised events, but fragmentations into countless isolated struggles, each participant fighting alone in their bubble of limited awareness, unable to contribute to or understand any larger tactical picture. The Viking Age warrior's experience of battle was fundamentally one of isolation, surrounded by hundreds of people but utterly alone in the chaos, fighting without knowledge, reacting without understanding, surviving or dying based on factors far beyond individual control or awareness. Chapter 23. The Disabled Survivors. Living casualties. Picture, if you will, the warriors who survived Viking Age battles, but with life-altering injuries, lost limbs, blindness, permanent mobility issues, chronic pain, disfigurement that destroyed social function. While saga culture celebrated those who died gloriously in battle, it had far less to say about those who lived but were broken. These disabled survivors faced a society that lacked medical knowledge to help them, social support systems to sustain them, and often the compassion to value them once their warrior function was destroyed. archaeological evidence reveals that some warriors survived extraordinarily severe injuries. Skeletal remains show healed amputations, limbs severed in battle or afterward to prevent infection spread, with bones showing evidence of survival for months or years after the trauma. Some remains show severe compound fractures that healed, leaving legs or arms permanently crooked and likely painful. Blindness from wounds wouldn't show in skeletal remains, but saga accounts mention one-eyed or blinded warriors, suggesting this disability was common enough to feature in cultural memory. These survivors faced immediate practical problems. A warrior who'd lost a leg or arm couldn't fight anymore, which in a warrior culture meant losing primary social status and purpose. He also couldn't perform many forms of labour, farming, craft work, ship handling, that required full physical capability. This meant economic vulnerability for himself and his family, who now had to support a dependent member who couldn't contribute productively. Some families managed this burden, but it strained resources and created tensions. The medical care available was primitive. Amputations were performed with saws, without anaesthesia beyond alcohol or herbal preparations, without sterile technique or antibiotics. Most people died from the procedure itself, shock, blood loss, or subsequent infection. Those who survived faced chronic pain, phantom limb sensations, and poorly healed stumps that might become infected months or years later. Prosthetics were crude if they existed at all, perhaps a wooden peg for a missing leg, but nothing functional for missing arms or hands. Mobility aids were limited to crutches or staves. What made the disabled survivor's situation particularly brutal was the cultural attitude toward physical wholeness. Viking Age society valued physical capability and appearance. Marriage prospects for disabled warriors virtually disappeared. Who would marry someone who couldn't work, couldn't protect the household, represented economic burden? Social status plummeted. The warrior who once sat in honoured positions at feasts might find himself relegated to corners or excluded entirely when his disfigurement disturbed other guests, or his disability made him seem pitiable rather than honourable. Some archaeological evidence hints at the grim reality of disabled lives. Skeletal remains showing severe healed battle injuries sometimes also show signs of poor nutrition in subsequent years, suggesting these individuals struggle to obtain adequate food. Some show evidence of secondary health problems, infections that developed in damaged areas years after initial injuries, bone changes suggesting chronic pain conditions, markers of systemic illness that might have been preventable with better care. The shortened lifespan suggested by some of these remains indicate that survival with severe disability often meant only a few additional years of difficult diminished existence. The psychological toll of disabling injury was likely enormous. Imagine being a warrior in your 20s, your identity built around physical prowess, your social status derived from combat capability, your economic prospects tied to your ability to labour or fight. Then you lose a leg to a battlefield amputation, or lose your vision from a head wound. Your warrior identity is destroyed. Your wife looks at you with pity or resentment rather than respect. Your children are ashamed of your disability. Your friends still fighting and raiding together while you sit home, useless, a burden. Consider a warrior who survives a battle but loses his right arm to a sword stroke that couldn't be treated effectively. He lives, the bleeding is controlled, infection doesn't kill him, the wound eventually heals. But he's left with a stump instead of an arm. He can't use a shield, can't grip a sword, can't do the two-handed labour of farming or woodcutting. His wife struggles to support the family while also caring for him. Their resources dwindle, community support is minimal, others have their own problems, and there's subtle resentment toward those who need ongoing help. He watches his children grow up in increasing poverty, knowing his survival is the cause. He becomes isolated, spending days alone while his family works. His disability defines him now, not his past battles, not his previous accomplishments, just the missing arm and the burden he represents. Years after the battle, he dies from an infection in his stump, and his family's relief is barely concealed at his funeral. So the next time you see disabled characters in medieval settings portrayed as wise counsellors or honoured veterans, remember that reality was often harsh isolation and poverty. Viking Age culture created and celebrated warriors, but had little interest in supporting those warriors once battle broke their bodies. The glorious wound was only glorious if you died from it. Surviving with severe disability often meant social death, accompanying physical impairment. The battlefield's casualties included those who lived, condemned to decades of struggle in bodies that no longer functioned properly, in a society that valued them only for capabilities they'd lost. Some deaths were slow, taking years to complete, and perhaps the cruelest were those where you survived the battle, but lost everything that had made your life meaningful or sustainable. Chapter 24. Disease as Weapon. Deliberate Biological Warfare. Let us now turn to one of the most disturbing aspects of Viking Age warfare, the deliberate use of disease and contamination as weapons. While we often think of biological warfare as a modern concern, medieval raiders and armies understood that disease could kill as effectively as swords, perhaps more so, and they wheel-aged this knowledge ruthlessly. The archaeological and historical evidence suggests systematic use of contamination tactics that killed far more people than direct combat ever did. The basic understanding existed that certain materials and practices caused illness. Medieval people knew that rotting corpses made people sick if they contaminated water or food. They knew that diseased animals spread illness to humans. They didn't understand bacteria or viruses, but they recognized patterns. Proximity to certain materials caused sickness, and these materials could be weaponized. The siege warfare of the period shows this knowledge in action, with besiegers deliberately contaminating resources defenders needed to survive. Archaeological evidence from some Viking Age siege contexts is particularly disturbing. Excavations near fortifications show mass animal graves dated to siege periods. Horses, cattle, sometimes dogs, buried in ways suggesting they were killed specifically for contamination purposes. Some were found in or near water sources that would have served the fortified settlements. The animals weren't butchered for food, but disposed of in ways that would maximise decay and contamination. Some show evidence of disease when they died, suggesting besiegers deliberately used diseased animals to spread illness. Wells and water sources were prime targets. Throwing dead animals into wells contaminated the water supply, forcing defenders to choose between thirst and disease. Some archaeological contexts show wells filled with animal remains and other organic matter during known conflict periods. The decomposing material would have made the water smell foul, taste terrible, and carry waterborne diseases. Communities dependent on these wells faced impossible choices: drink contaminated water and sicken, or abandon the water source and die of thirst. The human cost of these biological warfare tactics was enormous. Waterborne diseases, dysentery, cholera, various bacterial infections, killed with agonizing efficiency. Dysentery caused severe diarrhea, dehydration, and death within days for the vulnerable. Whole populations could be sickened simultaneously, overwhelming any care capability and creating cascading health crises. Children and elderly died first, then the already weakened, then even healthy adults as the disease spread through contaminated water everyone had to drink. Some saga accounts mention these tactics directly, though often in matter-of-fact language that doesn't emphasise the horror. References to driving dead cattle into enemy water supplies, to using disease-ridden goods as trade items, to creating conditions where populations would sicken. The language suggests these weren't exceptional tactics but standard strategic options, unremarkable enough to mention without moral commentary. Disease warfare wasn't considered dishonourable, it was simply effective. The civilian casualties from disease warfare far exceeded combatant deaths. A raid might kill dozens of warriors in combat, but thousands of civilians through contaminated water over subsequent weeks. Children, elderly, pregnant women, the most vulnerable populations bore the brunt of biological warfare. They had no protection, no treatment options, no ability to flee or fight back against invisible pathogens in their water and food. Imagine a farming settlement near a river in what's now England, mid-10th century. Viking raiders can't take the fortified town directly, so they employ other tactics. They kill a dozen cattle, wait for the bodies to bloat with decomposition gases, then roll them into the river upstream from the settlement. The settlement draws drinking water from this river. Within days, people begin sickening. First the children. Stomach cramps, bloody diarrhea, fever, then others. The settlement's healer has no understanding of bacteria, no treatment that works. She tries herbs, prayers, bloodletting. Nothing helps. Within 2 weeks, a quarter of the settlement's population is dead. Another quarter is too sick to function. The survivors are weakened, demoralised, unable to mount effective defence when the raiders return. The raiders never directly fought most of the people they killed. They just contaminated water and let disease do the work. Among the dead is a child, perhaps 6 years old, who dies after 3 days of severe dysentery. She doesn't understand why her stomach hurts so badly, why she can't stop the diarrhea, why her mother cries while trying to get her to drink water that only makes her sicker. She dies dehydrated and in pain, killed by bacteria she never saw from a tactic she never understood, a victim of warfare she wasn't even old enough to comprehend. Her death isn't counted in any battle toll, isn't remembered in any saga, isn't acknowledged as a casualty of war. She's just one of countless civilians killed by disease weapons that left no trace in heroic narratives. It's worth remembering that we often think of biological warfare as a modern atrocity, something that emerged from scientific understanding of pathogens. But deliberate use of disease as a weapon is ancient, requiring only the basic observation that certain practices caused illness and that this could be exploited. Viking Age raiders and warriors understood this and used it without hesitation, creating death tolls that made their combat casualties seem trivial by comparison. The sword killed individuals, contaminated water killed communities. Disease warfare was efficient, cost-effective, and horrifyingly successful, which is why it was used systematically despite the suffering it caused to the most vulnerable populations who had no way to defend themselves against invisible weapons in their water and food. Chapter 25. Archaeological evidence. What bones remember. Let us conclude our examination by turning to what physical remains reveal about Viking Age combat. The bones that have survived centuries to tell us truths that contemporary sources omitted or obscured. Modern forensic archaeology has transformed our understanding of medieval warfare by studying skeletal remains with scientific rigour, revealing patterns that contradict cultural narratives and expose the brutal reality beneath heroic legends. The methodology is precise. Archaeologists examine bone trauma patterns, distinguishing between wounds inflicted at or near death versus healed injuries from earlier conflicts. They analyse fracture angles to determine weapon types and strike directions. They study demographics, age, sex, social status indicators of battle casualties. They examine burial context to understand how bodies were handled after death. This scientific approach removes the narrative bias of written sources and gives us unfiltered evidence of what actually happened to bodies in Viking Age warfare. What the bones reveal is disturbing. Mass graves from Viking Age battle sites show casualty demographics that challenge our assumptions. Many skeletons are of young individuals, teenagers and early 20s, based on bone development and dental patterns. The warrior culture celebrated experienced veterans, but battlefields killed the young in disproportionate numbers. Some remains show no evidence of healed battle wounds, suggesting these were first-time combatants who died in their initial combat experience. The trauma patterns on bones tell stories of chaotic, brutal violence. Most skeletal remains show multiple wounds, not single heroic killing blows, but accumulated trauma suggesting warriors were struck many times before dying. Some skulls show evidence of being struck after death. continued violence even after the victim had ceased being a threat. Defensive wounds on forearms and hands are extremely common, showing warriors died trying to protect themselves rather than dealing out attacks. Many skeletons show wounds to backs or sides, indicating they were killed while fleeing or were attacked from unexpected directions. Perhaps the most striking finding is evidence that contradicts status-based survival narratives. Analysis of mass graves shows that wealthy warriors, identifiable by associated grave goods like expensive swords or ornate belt fittings, died at similar rates and with similar wound patterns as poor warriors with minimal equipment. The expensive armour didn't provide significant protection advantage. The superior training didn't improve survival rates noticeably. Social status, which Viking Age culture insisted made one a better warrior, showed no correlation with battlefield survival. Kings and slaves died side by side with comparable trauma patterns. Some specific findings are particularly revealing. At several Viking Age battle sites, forensic analysis has revealed that substantial percentages of casualties, sometimes 20 to 30%, show wound patterns consistent with being killed while helpless or fleeing. These aren't the honoured deaths of face-to-face combat that warrior culture celebrated. These are people struck down from behind while running, or killed while already incapacitated by earlier wounds. The heroic narrative erases these inglorious deaths, but the bones preserve the truth. Burial treatment varies in ways that illuminate social attitudes. Some mass graves show bodies piled without care, stripped naked, no attention to dignity or individual burial. Others show more organised treatment but still bulk disposal. A few individuals receive separate, more respectful burials, but these seem random rather than status-based, suggesting that battlefield survival of the body, not being destroyed beyond recognition, mattered more for burial treatment than social rank. The democratic horror of death in battle extended to how bodies were treated afterward. Consider an archaeological team excavating a Viking Age battle site in Britain, early 21st century. They uncover a mass grave containing over 300 individuals. As they carefully expose and document each skeleton, patterns emerge. A 14-year-old boy with defensive wounds on his forearms and a killing blow to the back of his head. He died trying to protect himself while fleeing. A wealthy warrior identifiable by his sword and arm rings, showing 5 separate skull fractures and multiple limb wounds. He wasn't killed cleanly but hacked apart by multiple attackers. A man in his 50s with healed battle wounds from earlier conflicts, killed by a spear thrust through his ribs. His experience didn't save him. They find brothers buried together. DNA analysis confirms relationship. One killed by a blow from behind, suggesting friendly fire or execution. The archaeologists reconstruct the battle from the bones, a shield wall clash that quickly dissolved into chaos, high casualty rates among the young and inexperienced, evidence of post-battle killing of the wounded, mass burial without ceremony. None of this matches the saga accounts of the same battle, which describe heroic duels and honourable deaths. The bones tell a different story, one of confused, brutal violence, where most died in glorious deaths and were buried without dignity, where youth and inexperience led to slaughter, where expensive equipment provided little protection against the chaos of melee combat. So, as we conclude this examination of Viking Age battle reality, let us remember that physical evidence outlasts propaganda. The bones don't lie in service of cultural narratives. They preserve the truth that contemporary sources obscured or ignored, that battles were chaotic slaughters where the young died disproportionately, where status didn't ensure survival, where most deaths were inglorious, and where the celebrated warrior culture was built on foundations of suffering that the culture itself refused to fully acknowledge. The archaeological evidence gives voice to those who died without glory, whose stories were erased by heroic narratives, whose broken bones are the only testimony remaining of their terrified last moments on battlefields they likely never wanted to be on. What bones remember is the truth that warrior cultures preferred to forget. And so, we reach the end of our examination of Viking Age battle reality. We've spent the last 2.5 hours exploring 25 aspects of combat that popular culture prefers to ignore or romanticize. We've examined the mud that drowned wounded warriors, the exhaustion that killed as surely as weapons, the friendly fire that made brothers kill brothers unknowingly in chaos. We've looked at the weight of equipment, the crushing pressure of shield walls, the projectile hell that opened battles. We've explored the medical realities of sword wounds, the sound and smell of combat, the berserker myth versus the drugged reality. We've seen how young many combatants were, teenagers forced into service, dying in terror in their first battles. We've examined the role of luck versus skill, discovering that expensive equipment and years of training didn't significantly improve survival rates when random arrows fell and chaos reigned. We've looked at the specific horrors of naval combat, where armour became death sentence if you entered the water, and the systematic looting that turned battlefields into execution grounds for wounded enemies. We've examined infection as the real killer, claiming victims days or weeks after they'd survived the actual fighting. We've seen how winter warfare added environmental threats that killed with hypothermic efficiency, how hand-to-hand combat devolved into animal desperation with rocks and teeth as weapons. We've explored the exhaustion that limited battles to brief, intense bursts before human bodies simply couldn't continue. We've looked at facial disfigurement, at the arbitrary role of chance in survival, at drowning in armour, at post-battle violence, at infection, at forced conscription. We've examined psychological trauma in a culture with no framework to acknowledge or treat it. The aftermath of corpse-strewn fields, the communication breakdown that made battles isolated chaos, the disabled survivors abandoned by the culture that created them. We've seen disease used deliberately as a weapon, and we've concluded by examining what archaeological evidence reveals, truths that bones preserve when cultural narratives obscure. The pattern that emerges from this examination is clear. Viking Age battles were brief, chaotic, terrifying experiences where most participants had little control over their survival, where the cultural celebration of warrior prowess obscured the random violence that actually determined outcomes, where the costs, physical, psychological, economic, were borne by those least able to afford them. The glorious warrior culture was built on foundations of mud, blood, infection, and trauma that the culture itself worked hard to forget or reframe. But of course, understanding the Viking Age reality of battle raises uncomfortable questions about warfare more generally, doesn't it? The specifics have changed, the weapons, the tactics, the medical care, but has the fundamental nature of combat changed as much as we might like to believe? Consider for a moment the parallels between what we've examined tonight and modern warfare. The technology has advanced dramatically. Automatic weapons instead of swords, helicopters instead of longships, antibiotics and trauma surgery instead of herbal poultices and amputation. But the human experience of combat shows remarkable continuity across the centuries. Modern soldiers still experience the chaos and confusion we've described, where situational awareness collapses and you fight in a bubble of limited information. Friendly fire remains a persistent problem. Improved communications reduce it but can't eliminate the fog of war. The sound of combat still causes permanent hearing damage despite ear protection. The psychological trauma is now recognised as PTSD and treated, but it still breaks people in ways that outlast physical wounds. The randomness of survival, being in the wrong place when an IED detonates, taking a bullet from a random burst of fire, still makes a mockery of narratives about skill determining outcomes. Young soldiers still bear disproportionate burden of combat casualties. Equipment quality still matters less than we'd like to think when violence becomes chaotic. Exhaustion still limits human performance regardless of training. The disabled survivors still struggle with physical limitations and societal attitudes that don't always value them appropriately. And the cultural narratives still tend to romanticize warfare in ways that obscure the actual experience of those who fight. Perhaps most tellingly, modern militaries still struggle with the same fundamental problem: how to motivate people to participate in activities that are terrifying, traumatic, and potentially lethal. The solutions remain similar: creating cultural narratives about honour and duty, providing economic incentives, using legal obligations and social pressure. We've replaced the Leidang system with selective service registration and promises of educational benefits, but the basic dynamic persists. Societies need people to fight their battles, and most people would rather not, so systems of inducement and coercion become necessary. The medical advances are real and significant. Modern combat medicine saves lives that would have been lost in earlier eras. But this also means more disabled survivors who need long-term support, creating different versions of the challenges Viking Age societies faced with warriors who lived but couldn't function as they had before. We have better prosthetics, better rehabilitation, better understanding of trauma, but we still struggle to fully support those whose bodies and minds were broken in service. Even the use of disease as a weapon persists, though in more sophisticated forms. Chemical and biological weapons are banned by international law, yet the basic insight remains: spreading illness can be militarily effective and may claim more victims than direct combat. The only real change is that we've acknowledged this as horrific, rather than accepting it as standard practice. The continuity across centuries suggests that something fundamental about organised human violence hasn't changed despite technological advances. The chaos, the trauma, the randomness, the costs borne disproportionately by the young and powerless, the cultural need to romanticise what can't be eliminated. These patterns persist because they emerge from human biology and social organisation, rather than from specific technologies or tactics. But I said this was boring history for sleep, didn't I? And here I am drawing uncomfortable parallels to contemporary issues, making your mind more active when the goal is to let it settle and release. Let me step back from that analysis. Thank you for staying with me through this long, detailed journey into Viking Age battle reality. I know 2.5 hours is a substantial commitment, and I'm grateful you chose to spend it here, learning about aspects of history that aren't typically celebrated or even acknowledged. Your willingness to engage with these darker truths, to sit with discomfort rather than demanding only comfortable narratives, is what makes this work possible and meaningful. If you found value in this examination, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. These long-form explorations take substantial research and preparation, reading archaeological reports, consulting academic sources, synthesizing information across multiple disciplines to create comprehensive pictures of historical realities. Your subscriptions and engagement help sustain this work and encourage me to continue creating content that prioritizes accuracy and depth over entertainment and myth. I'd be curious to know what aspects of tonight's examination surprised you most, or which details stayed with you. The comments section is open for your thoughts, though I understand many of you are listening as you fall asleep and probably won't be leaving comments tonight. That's perfectly fine. This content serves its purpose whether you engage actively or simply let it wash over you as you drift toward rest. The goal here has always been dual purpose: to provide genuinely educational content about historical realities that deserve examination, while also creating something that can help ease you towards sleep through detailed, methodical narration. Some of you are listening primarily for the information, taking notes, fully engaged with the content. Others are using the steady flow of historical detail as background that occupies your mind just enough to prevent anxious thoughts, while remaining gentle enough to allow sleep to approach. Both uses are valid and intended. What's important is that we've looked honestly at what Viking Age battles were actually like. Not the glamorized versions, not the sanitized narratives, but the muddy, chaotic, traumatic reality that warriors experienced and that cultures worked hard to obscure. In doing so, we've honoured the actual experiences of people who lived and died in circumstances they often didn't choose and couldn't control. But let me offer you something gentler now to carry you towards sleep. Picture, if you will, a quiet field somewhere in what's now England. It's not autumn of 937 or 991 or any specific year. It's now, today, 1,000 years and more after the battles we've discussed. The field is green with crops or grass. Wildflowers grow in patches. Birds nest in the hedgerows. Children might play here on summer afternoons. Farmers tend the land, coaxing food from soil that once was churned to mud by thousands of feet. If you dig deep enough in some of these fields, you still find things. An arrowhead, corroded but recognisable, a fragment of sword blade. Occasionally bones, though most have long since dissolved or been discovered and reburied. The evidence of violence remains beneath the peaceful surface, but it doesn't define the place anymore. Time has covered the trauma with layers of ordinary life, seasons of growth, generations of people who lived without warfare's immediate threat. This is what time does, eventually. The acute horror of battle, the screaming, the blood, the terror, lasts minutes or hours. The aftermath of trauma might last years or lifetimes for those who survived, but eventually the survivors die too, and their children who grew up with traumatized parents die, and their children's children who only heard stories die, until no living memory remains. The battlefields become just fields again. The trauma doesn't disappear but becomes historical rather than personal, something to study and understand rather than something to survive. You, dear listener, are lying in your own peaceful space right now. Perhaps a bed, warm and comfortable, perhaps a couch or chair that supports your body gently. You're separated from the violence we've discussed by centuries and geography, by medical advances and cultural changes, by the simple luck of when and where you were born. The warriors we've discussed tonight can't hurt you. Their trauma can't directly touch you. You're safe in your space, in your time, removed from their suffering by the merciful distance of history. Let that safety settle over you now like a blanket. Feel the comfort of your position, the support beneath you, the warmth around you. Your breathing is steady and calm. Your body is relaxed, releasing the day's tensions. The details we've explored tonight are interesting, perhaps disturbing, but they're not immediate threats. They're history, contained safely in the past, available for understanding but not demanding your fear or stress. As you drift towards sleep, you might reflect on how fortunate we are to live in times and places where battle isn't an expected part of life, where most of us will never experience the chaos and trauma we've examined tonight. Or you might simply let the thoughts go, releasing even the historical narratives, allowing your mind to empty and settle into the quiet darkness that precedes sleep. The channel will be here when you wake, with more examinations of history's unglamorous realities, more long-form explorations of topics that deserve detailed attention, more boring history that serves both educational and restful purposes. If you haven't subscribed, consider doing so in the morning. If you have, thank you again for your support and engagement. Sleep well, dear listener. Let the weight of history settle gently around you, not as burden, but as context, as reminder of how much has changed and how much remains constant about human experience. Let your breathing deepen, your muscles relax, your thoughts slow and soften. The warriors we've discussed tonight are long at rest. Their struggles are finished, their pain is ended, the fields they fought on are peaceful now, and you are safe, warm, comfortable, drifting gently toward the rest you need and deserve. Sleep well. I'll see you in the next exploration of boring history whenever you're ready for it. Good night.